A crown can hide a lot paranoia, delusion, obsession, even a horse in priestly robes. These aren't your textbook monarchs. They're kings who stole watches, emperors who married men in public ceremonies, and queens who slept beside coffins. Across centuries and continents, royalty has often tiptoed into the absurd, then sprinted. So dim the lights, silence the court, and prepare yourself for 53 tales of real royal behavior so bizarre, you'd swear they were fiction. This isn't just history. It's what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked personality. Welcome to 53 Bizarre But True Royal Street, Ories. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, especially if your idea of history includes emperors eating holy books and queens hiding dogs under their skirts. We've got plenty more where this came from. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Noon in New York? Let's see just how far this royal madness travels. Emperor Nero married a freedman named Pythagoras. Of all the fever dreams that passed for governance in ancient Rome, none came hotter or heavier than Emperor Nero's. Son of an ambitious mother and stepson to an emperor he may or may not have poisoned, Nero's reign was less about ruling an empire and more about rewriting reality to fit whatever delusion amused him that week. Rome, under Nero, became less of a capital and more of a stage, and the emperor, always its most committed actor. In the twilight years of his rule, Nero fell in love. Not with a noblewoman, not with a war, not with power, though he had all of those in surplus, but with a freedman named Pythagoras. Their romance, if that's the word, culminated in a public wedding. Nero wore the bridal veil. The dowry was state-funded, and the empire's political elite were forced to witness the groom emperor cry on cue during the vows. Historians note the ceremony included traditional Roman wedding rituals, animal sacrifice, joining of hands, a procession all inverted through Nero's love for performance and power. When he kissed Pythagoras, it wasn't scandalous because it was two men. It was scandalous because it was the emperor pretending to be the bride. The Roman Senate didn't dare flinch. They applauded, they bowed, and they added the event to official court records like they might a treaty or a military triumph. When you are ruled by a man who thinks he's both emperor and empress, who burns half of Rome and blames the Christians to cover his singing career, you learn to clap at all the wrong times or risk disappearing entirely. Nero's affection wasn't reserved solely for Pythagoras. He later married a boy named Sporus after having him castrated, of course, and publicly called him his wife as well. In Nero's warped cosmology, gender was malleable, power was performance, and identity was whatever he declared it to be in front of a stunned and silent Senate. He didn't just rule the Roman Empire, he directed it. And when Nero finally lost control, when the people who had once cheered his lyre playing turned on him and his own guards refused to protect him, he reportedly fled the city, disguised as a servant. A fitting end for a man who had spent his life in costume. The story of Nero isn't just a footnote in Roman excess. It's a reminder that when rulers become actors, reality becomes fiction and empires start to resemble fever dreams. The line between theatre and tyranny grows thin, and you can't always tell whether you're at a coronation or a dress rehearsal. And yet, compared to what came centuries later in the snowy streets of Moscow, Nero's masquerade might look tame. Because while Nero played the bride, the next royal let loose beasts to feast. Not metaphorically, literally. Ivan the Terrible, Russia kept pet bears to maul drunkards. There's eccentric, there's cruel, and then there's Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known by the kind of nickname you don't earn by being misunderstood. The Terrible. He ruled Russia like a medieval ghost story come to life, a man who wrapped paranoia in religious devotion and brutality in pageantry. He wasn't mad in the chaotic theatre kid way Nero was. Ivan was methodical, cold, devout in his own mind, and very, very fond of bears. Not metaphorical bears, real ones, kept as pets, roaming the streets of Moscow. You see, Ivan wasn't content with the standard trappings of absolute power. Thrones, boring, crown jewels, predictable. No, Ivan liked to keep pet bears and unleash them into public spaces to do what bears do best: terrify, maul, and occasionally devour. Especially if the targets were drunkards, beggars, or people he deemed morally loose. In Ivan's theological worldview, drunkenness was a sin, and apparently the cure for sin was bear attacks. The bears, of course, were symbols walking, growling reminders of who really ruled the streets. Forget the Orthodox priests or the Tsar's guards. In Ivan's Moscow, the line between divine punishment and state policy was patrolled by fur and claws. This wasn't an isolated eccentricity. It was part of a broader pattern. Ivan established a shadow police force known as the Oprichniki, men in black, riding black horses, carrying severed dog heads as symbols of their loyalty. They enacted purges, tortured nobles, and turned Russia into an early prototype of the surveillance state. But even with all that institutionalized terror, Ivan still found joy in letting the bears loose now and then, because nothing says divine authority like ursine punishment for public intoxication. Some historians have suggested this bear policy was more than punishment, that it was spectacle, a warning cloaked in absurdity. Others claim Ivan believed the animals could sense sin, as though he'd invented some orthodox version of a moral bloodhound. But really, like so many autocrats before and after him, Ivan liked to see people squirm. He liked knowing he could reshape the laws of nature, or at least weaponize them. It wasn't just the bears. Ivan would orchestrate mock trials for his enemies, deliver long-winded theological sermons in court, and then order executions right after prayer. His relationship with faith wasn't contradictory, it was strategic. He saw himself as God's chosen enforcer, a Tsar by divine will, and if that divine will included a bear flattening a drunk merchant outside a tavern, so be it. His reign ended with a whimper, not a roar. Racked by illness, paranoia, and possibly mercury poisoning from his medical treatments, Ivan died during a game of chess. That's the official version, anyway. Some believe he was poisoned. Others think he died of guilt. But most likely, it was simply the body of a man who had lived too long in a state of holy war with the world, with his court, with himself. And still, the bears outlived him. In the twisted timeline of royal hobbies, Ivan's Beast Patrol stands out not just for its cruelty, but for its almost surreal logic. He didn't just want to rule his people. He wanted to test them morally, physically, and occasionally with large carnivores. Power wasn't enough unless it walked on 4 legs and could rip your arm off. Of course, not all monarchs were so dramatic in their destruction. Some preferred a quieter sort of sabotage, the kind that came in a golden vial, sweet to the taste, lethal to the teeth. And if you've made it this far through royal bathroom ceremonies and queens with contraband canines, you're exactly our kind of people. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next descent into historical absurdity. Queen Elizabeth I, England, destroyed her own teeth with a tooth-cleaning potion. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Elizabeth I's titles were as grand as her portraits were flattering. She was the monarch of myth, wrapped in ruffles, pearls, and political theatre. Her reign was a masterclass in image control. But behind the mask, and it was, quite literally, a mask of lead-based makeup. There was a woman falling apart by inches, quite often, starting with her teeth. Elizabeth, like many of her contemporaries, had a sweet tooth, not the cute kind, the state-sponsored kind. Sugar, newly imported and painfully expensive, became the glittering status symbol of the elite, and Elizabeth indulged liberally. Not just in food, but in an odd concoction she used as a tooth-cleaning potion, which was, in essence, liquefied sugar. Yes, to clean her teeth. It was the Tudor equivalent of brushing with frosting and wondering why your dentist is always crying. The potion, lauded by court physicians, was supposed to freshen the breath and whiten the teeth. What it actually did was erode enamel faster than a French invasion. Foreign ambassadors remarked on the Queen's blackened, rotting teeth which she kept hidden behind fans, veils, and tight-lipped smiles. But Elizabeth didn't just suffer in silence, she flaunted it. When a Polish ambassador complained about her inability to speak clearly during a meeting due to the state of her mouth, she reportedly snapped that a queen need not enunciate like a commoner, which is another way of saying, "I'm royalty, I'll rot in style." It didn't stop there. In her later years, Elizabeth's gums receded, her appetite waned, and her famously elaborate meals became mostly performative. Her court cooks prepared elaborate sugar sculptures, edible castles, flowers, entire mythical scenes more for display than consumption. Decadence was diplomacy. And yet, for all the power she held, Elizabeth remained terrified of dentists. She once reportedly delayed a tooth extraction until her court physician yanked one of his own teeth first, just to prove it wouldn't be fatal. That was the bar for medical reassurance in the 16th century. But what's more fascinating than the Queen's oral disintegration is what it says about monarchy itself, that even at the height of empire, with naval dominance, religious reformation, and an intelligence network that would make MI6 jealous the most powerful woman in the world, still poisoned herself daily in pursuit of purity. Because that was the real paradox of Elizabeth's reign. She cultivated an image of untouchable perfection, a goddess in human form, while slowly disintegrating from the inside out. The teeth were just the first to go. Behind the powdered wigs and staged spectacles was a woman battling the very symbols she'd constructed. And in the shadow of this sugary downfall, another monarch was quietly unraveling in far darker ways, not with rot, but with fragility. A king convinced he was made of glass, terrified the world might shatter him with a touch. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Royal bloodlines have a way of curdling. Too much isolation, too much power, too many centuries of breeding with one's cousin, and suddenly the divine right to rule starts looking more like a medical anomaly. Charles VI of France is a case study in what happens when the crown sits too long on the wrong head. At first, he was promising. Crowned at 11, ruling by 21, and called Charles the Beloved, before things took a very public, very fragile turn. The story goes that during a routine military march in 1392, Charles suddenly halted his horse, drew his sword, and attacked his own knights. When it was over, several were dead. Charles collapsed, and when he awoke, he was no longer beloved. He was broken. Doctors tried to make sense of it. Bloodletting, prayer, astrology, the usual medieval toolkit. But none of it worked. What followed were decades of decline punctuated by delusions that would have been comical if they weren't so tragic. The most infamous? Charles became convinced he was made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically. He genuinely believed that if anyone touched him even gently, he might shatter into pieces. He wore reinforced clothing and refused physical contact. Sometimes he sat perfectly still for hours, terrified to move. He ordered iron rods sewn into his garments for protection, essentially becoming a walking chandelier in chainmail. Court physicians were baffled. Theologians argued it was divine punishment. The nobles, well, they mostly tried not to spook him. This wasn't a fleeting episode. It went on for years. And it wasn't his only delusion. At one point, Charles forgot he was king entirely. He couldn't recognize his wife, his children, or even his own name. He wandered the palace calling for people who had died long ago. At other times, he barked like a dog or claimed he was made of different substances, ice, wax, wind. But the glass fixation stuck, probably because, deep down, it wasn't far from the truth. Because Charles wasn't wrong to feel fragile. His kingdom was crumbling. France was locked in the 100 Years' War with England, bleeding money, soldiers, and legitimacy. His wife, Queen Isabeau, quietly took the reins of power, while ambitious nobles played chess with the royal court. Assassinations became seasonal. Loyalties flipped like tavern cards. The country wasn't just unstable, it was cracking under pressure. And Charles, translucent, terrified. Charles was the perfect metaphor. A man who believed a single touch could undo him, ruling a nation that was already coming apart at the seams. Some historians speculate his condition was schizophrenia. Others suggest bipolar disorder compounded by stress and genetic predisposition. But whatever the diagnosis, Charles's reign reveals something deeper, that monarchies, for all their pomp and permanence, are often held together by threadbare illusions. And when the person wearing the crown stops believing in their own solidity, the whole facade starts to ripple. The tragedy is that Charles lived for over 40 years after his first major breakdown. That's 4 decades of ritual, performance, and political manipulation, with a king who might cry if you tapped him on the shoulder. It's a long time to pretend. And the longer he reigned, the more surreal things became. His royal seals had to be reissued every time he had an episode, because no one could be sure if the king remembered who he was. His signature changed. His advisors changed. His enemies multiplied. France, under Charles VI, became less of a kingdom and more of a haunted house with tax collectors. But maybe Charles had it right in a twisted way. Maybe he saw the truth too clearly. That royalty, like glass, can be both beautiful and dangerously breakable. That under the glitter of crowns and scepters lies something brittle, transparent, and deeply afraid. And if you think that's unsettling, a king afraid to be touched, wait until you meet the monarch who could barely keep his hands off himself. A king so enthralled by the pleasures of the flesh that even court affairs had to wait until his private rituals were concluded. King Christian VII of Denmark, obsessed with self-pleasure. Christian VII of Denmark was never meant for politics. He was meant for mirrors. Born into privilege and carefully bred eccentricity, Christian ascended to the throne at just 17 years old. What followed was not so much a reign as a long, slow unraveling of a man who seemed more interested in his reflection than his responsibilities. Contemporary reports describe Christian as erratic, childlike, and chronically distracted, which, translated from 18th century diplomacy, means nobody had any idea what he was doing. While other monarchs were reading military dispatches or signing treaties, Christian was reportedly engaged in hours-long private meditations, which is exactly the kind of euphemism it sounds like. And yes, the rumors were true. The king had an obsession, not with power, not with statecraft, with himself. While Denmark tried to modernize, Christian would vanish for long stretches into his private chambers. Courtiers learned to never interrupt. Decisions stalled. Ministers waited. The Danish Empire was placed on pause for what historians might delicately call non-legislative activity. Eventually, a saying spread through the palace. "The king is indisposed," which was code for, "We'll try again once he's finished." But Christian wasn't entirely isolated. He had companions, if you could call them that. Chief among them was Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who became Christian's confidant, de facto regent, and, controversially, the lover of the Queen. Yes, while Christian was occupied, Struensee ran the country. He issued reforms, overhauled the justice system, and made Denmark, briefly, a beacon of Enlightenment ideals. It might have worked if not for the scandal. The Queen's affair with Struensee became public. The Conservatives struck back. And while Christian sat confused through the trial, Struensee was arrested and the Queen exiled. The king, apparently oblivious, returned to his quiet routines, as the court put it. In time, Christian's mental condition worsened. Some called it schizophrenia, others extreme emotional trauma from childhood abuse. Whatever the case, by the time he was 30, the king was king in name only. Denmark was run by a rotating cast of advisors, all careful to keep Christian calm, distracted, and mostly indoors. But here's the deeper irony. Christian's reign, for all its dysfunction, led accidentally to some of the most progressive reforms in Danish history. The man who couldn't finish a council meeting helped end censorship, modernize education, and reduce the power of the nobility, all by sheer negligence. He created a vacuum that better men briefly filled. Christian VII was a king who ruled from behind a locked door, who saw his authority not as a tool of service, but as an inconvenience to his private joys. He reminds us that not every royal crisis comes with swords or speeches. Some just come with silence and a very long wait. And while Christian may have escaped into fantasy, the next monarch built it into stone. Castles without guests, dinners without people, and operas performed for empty rooms. A man who dreamed so vividly, reality lost its grip on him entirely. King Ludwig II of Bavaria built fairy tale castles and dined with imaginary guests. There are monarchs who ruled empires, and there are monarchs who ruled daydreams. Ludwig II of Bavaria belonged entirely to the latter. Known as the fairy tale king, Ludwig seemed less interested in governing 19th century Bavaria and more invested in reimagining the Middle Ages, with himself cast as the tragic hero. His court wasn't one of ministers and advisors. It was an empty stage set for operas that never played to an audience, castles that were never meant to be lived in, and elaborate dinners shared with no one but ghosts. Ludwig inherited the throne in 1864, but from the start, he didn't quite take to politics. He found statecraft boring, parliamentary debates offensive to his poetic sensibilities, and ministers to be dreadful company. What he loved truly, obsessively, was art. And not just any art. He was consumed by the mythic, melodramatic works of composer Richard Wagner. So much so that Ludwig essentially became Wagner's personal benefactor, building extravagant theatres to stage his operas and showering him with royal favours, even as Bavaria's coffers quietly bled dry. Then came the castles. Not one, not two, but a series of architectural fantasies, most famously Neuschwanstein, the snow-dusted, turreted marvel later used by Disney as inspiration for its own dream palaces. But unlike Cinderella's castle, Ludwig's creations weren't built to host balls or armies. They were built to host solitude. Inside, he constructed artificial caves, chambers painted with Norse legends, and throne rooms with no throne. Everything was grand, symbolic, and profoundly empty. He dined alone at enormous tables, sometimes setting places for historical or mythical figures. Court staff were instructed never to interrupt. Meals were often lowered to him by dumb waiters so he wouldn't have to see another soul. His only real audience was his imagination. Sometimes he wrote long letters to dead monarchs. Other times he staged entire plays with himself in the lead role, the supporting cast consisting of memories and mirrors. By the 1880 seconds, Ludwig had retreated so far into his personal mythology that Bavaria essentially ran without him. Ministers began to whisper, doctors were summoned. Eventually, a panel declared the king insane without even examining him in person. Within days, Ludwig was deposed and placed under state custody. He died shortly after, under mysterious circumstances. The official report said drowning. Others claimed conspiracy. Some say he walked into the lake on purpose. Still others suggest he was trying to escape a world that no longer fit the one he had built in his head. What's undeniable is that Ludwig left behind more than scandal or political drama. He left behind stone dreams, frozen fairy tales etched into the Bavarian landscape. His castles, once seen as symbols of extravagance and madness, became national treasures. The irony is sharp. The king who bankrupted his kingdom on imaginary kingdoms ended up funding it posthumously through tourism. Ludwig reminds us that the boundary between genius and delusion isn't always a line. Sometimes it's a spiral staircase inside a castle no one else asked for. But while Ludwig escaped into solitude and fantasy, the next emperor invited the wild in, and we don't mean philosophically, we mean literally, claws, teeth, and all inside his royal residence. Emperor Rudolf II, Holy Roman Empire, kept a zoo inside his castle. If King Ludwig II turned his home into a stage set, then Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire turned his into a menagerie. Prague Castle during Rudolf's reign in the late 16th century was not a court in the traditional sense. It was a curiosity cabinet stretched across miles. A place where alchemists tinkered in towers, philosophers debated in smoky halls, and, most famously, lions and tigers casually roamed the inner courtyards, not in cages, but as a kind of living decor. Rudolf was no conventional monarch. He came to power at a time when Europe was tearing itself apart over theology and territory. He responded by doing the only logical thing, turning his imperial residence into a full-time salon of mystics, inventors, astrologers, and animals. The royal zoo wasn't built for entertainment or diplomacy. It was built because Rudolf was obsessed not just with collecting knowledge, but with collecting everything. If it was rare, strange, or potentially magical, he wanted it within reach. And so the castle swelled, with lions, with apes, with exotic birds that shrieked over diplomatic meetings. Visitors to Prague reported surreal encounters. A baboon stealing fruit from a visiting ambassador, or an alchemist mixing metals while an ocelot napped under the table. This wasn't spectacle. It was Rudolf's idea of ambience. The emperor believed that by surrounding himself with the mysteries of nature, he could unlock divine secrets. He funded astrologers to chart the future, magicians to interpret the stars, and scientists to transmute metals. He hired the best minds of his day like astronomer Tycho Brahe and his assistant Johannes Kepler, and then set them loose among the madness. Imagine trying to invent planetary laws while a jaguar strolls past your desk. Rudolf himself remained a recluse, often disheveled, deeply melancholic, and prone to long silences. He rarely left the castle. When he did, it was often at night. Diplomats found it almost impossible to schedule meetings with him. His letters read like riddles. His policies were vague or missing entirely. Over time, the empire began to slide not with chaos, but with absence. It wasn't that Rudolf ruled badly. It was that he stopped ruling altogether. By the time he was officially deposed by his own brother, Rudolf had become a ghost emperor, surrounded by cages, libraries, and cages that doubled as libraries. He died in 1612, quietly, as his exotic animals wandered the halls. Today, Prague still remembers Rudolf not as a conqueror or a kingmaker, but as a collector of impossibilities. His legacy is less about battles won and more about the sheer absurdity of what he tried to assemble under one roof: science, sorcery, and snow leopards. And if you think that sounds eccentric, wait until you meet the king who believed a tree was royalty and insisted on giving it a diplomatic handshake. George III of England tried to shake hands with a tree. If there's one thing British monarchs have always done well, it's maintain a stiff upper lip in the face of absolute absurdity. But George III, the very same king who lost the American colonies, had a relationship with reality that fluctuated, frayed, and occasionally snapped like a weathered violin string. By the end of his reign, that stiff upper lip was talking to trees, issuing royal commands to empty chairs, and once, most memorably, attempting to shake hands with what he believed was the King of Prussia. Unfortunately, the King of Prussia was a tree. Let's back up. George III ascended to the throne in 1760, and for much of his early reign, he was diligent, pious, and notably frugal, practically allergic to the excessive flair his forebears enjoyed. He read every state paper, refused to gamble, and was loyal to his wife in a court where extramarital affairs were practically a job requirement. He was, in many ways, the kind of ruler Parliament had been hoping for, but beneath that sober exterior, something was ticking. Around 1788, the ticking grew louder. George began to experience what would later be identified as bouts of mental illness. He talked incessantly for hours without pause, sometimes for days. He repeated himself, lost control of his impulses, and most famously during one of his less coherent episodes tried to greet a tree in Windsor Great Park as if it were visiting royalty. The story is usually told with a kind of wry British charm. The monarch, confused but courteous, bowing low and offering a handshake to an oak tree he sincerely believed was a fellow sovereign. Now, historians debate whether that precise anecdote is apocryphal or not, but the symbolic truth of it holds. George had entered a realm where the structures of monarchy, formality, diplomacy, hierarchy were still alive in his mind, but detached from the world around him. He hadn't stopped being king. He had simply started ruling a different version of reality. During these periods of mental decline, his behavior grew more erratic. He would lecture for hours, mixing theology with royal decrees. His physicians, unsure of how to treat him, resorted to isolation and questionable remedies. At times, George improved and returned to public life, but the pattern repeated. Each episode took a bit more of him with it. Despite this, he remained deeply sympathetic to the public. In fact, he became more beloved during his illness, a symbol of vulnerability in an age when monarchs were supposed to be above all that. Plays and pamphlets depicted him as a tragic figure, suffering not from moral failure, but from forces beyond his control. And while the state quietly handed power to his son, the Prince Regent, George was never formally removed. He remained king in title, even as he receded further into silence. By the end of his life, George was blind, deaf, and entirely withdrawn. The man who had once ruled over an empire now existed in a quiet cocoon of memory and delusion. And yet, the British monarchy endured stiff-lipped, well-dressed, and just functional enough to survive. But while George mistook trees for kings, his imperial counterpart in Russia wasn't confused at all. In fact, he knew exactly what he wanted: order, discipline, and clean-shaven faces, even if he had to rip the beards off himself. Peter the Great forced courtiers to shave beards. Peter the Great wasn't content with dragging Russia into the modern age. He wanted to yank it by the beard, literally. When he ascended to the throne in the late 17th century, Russia was, by Western European standards, medieval. The nobility wore long robes, grew out their beards as a sign of piety, and still referred to Western customs with suspicion, if not outright contempt. Peter saw all of this as a problem, a solvable one. His solution? Shave it all off. The beard, in Russia, wasn't just facial hair, it was a theological and cultural statement. The Orthodox Church viewed beards as sacred, part of the divine order of man. To shave one was practically heresy. Peter didn't care. He saw the beard as a symbol of backwardness, an obstacle to modernization, and therefore expendable. So, in true imperial fashion, he issued a decree. All men of rank must shave. Those who resisted would be taxed. Those who refused outright could have their beards forcibly removed. By force, we mean Peter himself was known to carry shears and scissors, gleefully cutting the beards of his courtiers at parties like some demented royal barber. Guests at court never quite knew whether they'd leave with a title or a missing mustache. To institutionalize the reform, Peter introduced the beard tax. Any man who wanted to keep his beard had to pay a fee and carry a special token proving he had paid a kind of license to bristle. The token itself was a small metal coin inscribed with the words, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Bureaucracy meets barbershop. This wasn't just about grooming. It was Peter's way of waging war on tradition. He wanted Russia to compete with Europe's powers, and that meant dressing like them, speaking like them, and yes, shaving like them. He reformed the military, created a navy from scratch, rewrote civil codes, and built a new capital, St. Petersburg on a swamp, just to make a point. But somehow, the beard campaign remains one of his most memorable quirks. Of course, not everyone accepted it quietly. The beard tax caused widespread resentment, particularly among the conservative classes and clergy. Protests broke out. Some men fled to remote regions rather than defile their chins, but Peter pressed on. He wasn't after popularity, he was after transformation. Historians sometimes call him an enlightened despot, but there was little subtle about his style. He saw the old Russia as a relic, and he had no patience for relics unless they were being repurposed as modern propaganda. Beard by beard, robe by robe, Peter carved out a new identity for his empire. And he did it with all the charm of a man who might, at any moment, whip out a pair of scissors and make you modern whether you liked it or not. But if Peter demanded transformation through razors, the next royal dealt with grief in the most haunting way imaginable by refusing to accept that death had happened at all. Queen Joanna of Castile, Joanna the Mad, slept beside her dead husband's coffin. History has an unkind habit of labeling women mad when they do anything outside the acceptable range of royal melancholy. But Queen Joanna of Castile didn't just grieve loudly. She grieved persistently, theatrically, and across several hundred miles of Spanish countryside with her husband's coffin in tow. Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, yes, the ones who sent Columbus sailing off into infamy, was never supposed to inherit much. She was the third child, dutifully married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy in a diplomatic shuffle. But fate, as it often does with royalty, cleared a tragic path to power. Her siblings died. Her mother passed. Suddenly, Joanna became queen of a sprawling empire. Unfortunately, her mind was unraveling almost as fast as the royal succession. The turning point came with Philip's unexpected death in 1506. Joanna's grief was not private, nor was it particularly brief. She refused to bury his body. She believed he was still alive, merely sleeping, or perhaps under some spell. And so, rather than entomb him, she kept him close, literally. Joanna travelled with Philip's casket, opening it regularly to gaze upon him, talk to him, and ensure no other woman dared steal his attention, even in death. Her court, horrified but obedient, followed her as she wandered the countryside. She avoided convents out of fear that nuns might covet her deceased husband. The coffin was treated as if Philip were merely indisposed, not decaying. If this was madness, it was a madness that required logistics, guards, horses, routes planned to accommodate a royal corpse on tour. This wasn't a short episode. Joanna's travelling vigil went on for months, even years by some accounts. Eventually, she was confined to a convent by her father Ferdinand, ostensibly for her safety, though it conveniently kept the throne out of her hands. Later, her son Charles, who would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor, continued the imprisonment. Joanna spent nearly 5 decades under various forms of house arrest, isolated, labelled mad, and stripped of power. What's most disturbing isn't just Joanna's grief, but how useful it was to the men around her. Whether or not she was mentally ill, and most historians agree, she likely suffered from some form of psychosis or extreme depression. Her affliction was politically convenient. The Mad Queen narrative kept her sidelined while her father and son ruled in her name. She died in 1555, having spent the majority of her life behind walls, built more for containment than care. Her story is remembered less for her policies, which she was never allowed to make, and more for the image of a woman clinging to a coffin, marching across Spain with love, loss, and legacy strapped to a mule cart. But grief, at least, was passive. The next ruler didn't just police morality. He declared war on wine, women, and dogs, sometimes all at once, and not always in that order. Caliph Al-Hakim, Amr Allah, Fatimid, Egypt, banned grapes, dogs, and women from the streets. If Joanna mourned obsessively, Caliph Al-Hakim, Amr Allah of the Fatimid Caliphate, ruled obsessively with a set of laws that made religious orthodoxy look like casual suggestion. His reign over Egypt from 996 to 1021 was a 25-year performance in divine micromanagement. At first, he seemed a promising young ruler, but soon, Al-Hakim became known less for policy and more for prohibitions. Lots of them. His bans were infamous. He outlawed eating grapes, not just wine, but grapes in any form. A perfectly innocent fruit, now contraband. Dogs, banned. All of them. Rounded up, removed from the streets. Why? No official reason, though speculation ranged from hygiene to theology to personal dislike. And women, half the population, were forbidden from leaving their homes entirely. No shopping, no visiting, not even standing on balconies. Tailors were forbidden from making women's shoes to discourage them from walking in public at all. It was less a policy than an erasure. The logic behind these rulings was unclear, sometimes religious, sometimes arbitrary, sometimes reversed entirely. At one point he banned the drinking of milk, then he banned shellfish. Then he decided that selling honey was punishable by death. Storekeepers lived in fear of accidentally carrying the wrong product at the wrong time. His whims shifted like desert winds. And yet, Al-Hakim wasn't simply a tyrant. He was also an ascetic, spending long hours in philosophical contemplation, wandering the streets of Cairo in the dead of night disguised as a commoner. He was known to stop shopkeepers and citizens, questioning them about morality, piety, and obedience to his decrees. Sometimes he rewarded them, Sometimes he had them punished on the spot. He also declared himself a divine figure, not metaphorically, but quite literally, claiming a mystical connection to God that elevated him above not just his subjects, but theology itself. This claim gave rise to a religious movement, the Druze faith, which still survives today, venerating Al-Hakim as a central divine figure. So while he was rewriting Cairo's street laws, he was also rewriting heaven. Eventually, even his inner circle grew wary. In 1021, Al-Hakim went on one of his nightly walks and never returned. His body was never found. Official records remain vague. Some say he was assassinated by his own sister. Others believe he simply disappeared to fulfill his divine destiny. Either way, his death was as mysterious as his decrees. His reign is remembered not for what he built, but for what he banned. A list of "thou shalt nots" that reads like the rules of a kingdom governed by impulse. A caliph who ruled like a mystic hermit, imposing his asceticism on an entire civilization. And if you think that level of excess is bizarre, wait until you meet the ruler who built a literal palace out of wine and practically bathed in it. Caliph Al-Walid II built a palace with fountains of wine. Some rulers lead with vision, others with fear. Caliph Al-Walid II of the Umayyad dynasty ruled with a goblet in each hand and music in the air. His reign, though brief, became infamous not for conquest or reform, but for one very specific achievement. He built a palace where the fountains didn't pour water, they flowed with wine. Al-Walid II inherited the caliphate in 743, and almost immediately he set about reshaping the royal court to better reflect his personal values. And by values, we mostly mean an aggressive appreciation for leisure. While other caliphs were constructing mosques or negotiating power with tribal leaders, Al-Walid was curating pleasure gardens and planning elaborate concerts. The wine fountains weren't a metaphor, they were real. His new desert palace, known as Al-Qasr al-Kush, was designed as a pleasure complex, one where alcohol, poetry, and entertainment weren't occasional indulgences, they were the foundation of statecraft. Naturally, this did not go over well with the religious establishment. Islamic law prohibited wine, and the caliph, as both political and religious leader, was expected to lead by pious example. Al-Walid's response was simple. He ignored them. More than that, he mocked them. He commissioned poems in praise of wine, held debauched feasts during sacred months, and reportedly called religious scholars dull men who fear joy. The palace itself became a symbol of excess. It featured marble columns, domed halls, exotic animals in enclosed gardens, and courtyards lit by hundreds of oil lamps. In the center, the wine fountains engineered with almost perverse ingenuity. Al-Walid wanted to leave no doubt that he intended to rule not with divine modesty, but with Dionysian flair. Even the musicians he hired came with controversy. He surrounded himself with performers who were considered scandalous at the time, female vocalists, string players, and poets who specialized in verses not fit for polite recitation. While Al-Walid's court was reveling, the provinces were bristling. Tribal leaders felt alienated. The religious elite were horrified, and whispers of rebellion began to spread. But Al-Walid didn't seem to care. His rule was short, just over a year. In 744, he was overthrown and assassinated by his cousin, Yazid III, who promptly condemned Al-Walid's decadence and promised to restore moral order. The fountains were dismantled. The poets were exiled. The music stopped. And yet, centuries later, Al-Walid's palace remains a curious symbol of resistance, not political, but philosophical. A man who, in the face of rigid orthodoxy, chose to build a kingdom of art, wine, and defiant beauty. He didn't just rebel against religious authority, he tried to engineer pleasure into architecture. But rebellion takes many forms. Some rulers defy doctrine with indulgence. Others oppose it with contradictions so deep they border on satire. Like the caliph who claimed to hate music then filled his palace with it anyway. Caliph Yazid III, Umayyad, proclaimed that he hated music, then filled his palace with musicians. If Al-Walid II's reign was a wine-soaked symphony, then Yazid III's was a carefully rehearsed pause followed by a confusing encore. Where his cousin had embraced excess openly, Yazid entered office with solemnity and pious declarations. He was, after all, the moral corrective, the course corrector, the one who would right the wrongs of a caliphate recently ruled by a man more concerned with musical tempo than political tempo. Upon taking power, Yazid made a series of public pronouncements. Chief among them was a condemnation of music. He declared it a corrupting force, a distraction from faith, and a moral rot that had infected the heart of the caliphate. Performers were banished, instruments destroyed. Public singing was declared un-Islamic. It was, briefly, the era of silence. But not for long, because behind palace walls, something odd began to happen. While Yazid railed against music in public, he began quietly hiring court musicians in private, not just any musicians, the best in the empire. Oud players, harpists, vocalists from distant provinces, even dancers. Not for state events, of course. That would have been hypocritical. Instead, these performers were summoned for private evenings of reflection. In other words, the music was for him. As it turned out, Yazid had a deeply personal love of music. He played instruments himself. He composed poetry. Some even say he could sing, though not in public, naturally. His condemnation of music wasn't insincere exactly. It was more like a guilty monologue. He believed it was dangerous. But like all forbidden fruits, the danger was part of the appeal. To make the contradiction even sharper, he ordered the construction of new palace halls designed with acoustics in mind. Whispering galleries, domed ceilings for perfect resonance, and marble floors that made every note echo like a divine whisper. These were not the architectural choices of a man avoiding music. They were the blueprints of a secret symphony. This duality became a running joke in elite circles. Poets mocked him carefully and never directly. One infamous quip described Yazid's reign as a hymn against hymns, sung sweetly under the moonlight. The people may not have heard the music, but they could feel it vibrating through the empire's marble walls. Yazid III died less than a year into his reign. His rule was short, conflicted, and defined not by action but by contradiction. A man who condemned sound and then bathed in it, who believed himself a reformer but couldn't resist the same pleasures he denounced. In a way, he was a perfect reflection of the human condition, pulled between virtue and temptation, law and desire, doctrine and melody. And from that quiet palace filled with secret harmonies, we move to a floating one built not for sin or prayer, but for boat parties so lavish they turned rivers into runways. Caliph Al-Mutawakil, Abbasid, ordered a floating palace built on the Tigris River. Power, when it becomes too permanent, starts to play. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Mutawakil ruled from the 9th century capital of Samarra, a city built almost entirely to reflect his grandeur. But he wasn't content with the usual flourishes of imperial vanity. No, Al-Mutawakil looked at the great Tigris River, one of the lifelines of Mesopotamian civilization, and thought, "This needs a palace that moves." And so he built one. Known as the Josak al-Haqqani, Al-Mutawakil's river palace was less a houseboat and more a floating monument to executive excess. Entire structures were mounted on giant barges, decorated with gold, marble, silks, and complex irrigation systems that sprayed scented water. It was the kind of thing you construct only when the land has bored you. A palace that didn't just overlook the river, it was the river. Why build a floating palace? Officially, it was for leisure. Realistically, it was to impress. Guests who boarded the moving structure were treated to banquets as the palace drifted downstream, with musicians playing in open-air balconies, perfumed fountains misting over silk awnings, and entire court rituals unfolding while the scenery glided by like a living tapestry. In the public version of this story, it's about innovation. In the real version, it's about distance. Al-Mutawakil had grown increasingly paranoid. His relationships with his advisors, generals, and even his own family were fraying. A floating palace wasn't just a status symbol, it was a fortress with no fixed address. If you can't trust the land, take to the water. His political decisions mirrored the instability of his river escapades. He frequently shifted alliances, ousted trusted ministers, and reversed policies with dizzying speed. His crackdown on various religious minorities earned him notoriety, but it also revealed his erratic need for control. Scholars say he oscillated between acts of patronage and paranoia with no clear pattern. Eventually, the river palace became symbolic of his reign itself, beautiful, extravagant, and completely unmoored. He was assassinated by his own Turkish guard in 861, the same military force he had relied on for protection. It's said that they killed him in his sleep, though others argue it happened during a feast. Either way, his body did not float ceremoniously down the Tigris. The floating palace was later dismantled, its parts used for other structures, its memory preserved in the confused admiration of later historians. It remains one of the strangest footnotes in the architecture of power, a reminder that when rulers start building palaces that move, it's usually because something in them has stopped standing still. And while Al-Mutawakil drifted in style, another ruler sent shockwaves through medieval Europe with something even more confusing than a floating castle. A mechanical clock so advanced, people thought it was magic. Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent Charlemagne, a mechanical clock thought to be sorcery. In the 9th century, Charlemagne ruled over a patchwork empire stitched together by swords, treaties, and sheer personality. He was Europe's great unifier, crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope himself. But when he received a gift from the East from the glittering court of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, even he was reportedly stunned into silence. The gift? A clock. Not a sundial, not a sand timer, a mechanical clock. From Baghdad. And this wasn't just any clock. It was a towering, elaborate machine that ticked with precision and theatrical flair. Bronze horsemen emerged on the hour. Balls dropped into bowls with rhythmic chimes. Tiny doors opened and shut, revealing figures of falcons, lions, and men, all animated by hidden gears and water-driven mechanisms. To Western eyes, it was less a device and more a miracle. Charlemagne's court didn't know what to make of it. According to accounts, some of his advisors thought the clock was bewitched. Others believed it must contain demons or spirits. In a Europe where mechanical complexity still meant a windmill, Baghdad had sent them something that looked like it belonged in the future or in a sorcerer's study. Harun al-Rashid, of course, knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just sending a gift, he was sending a message. We are ahead. The clock was a symbol of the Abbasid Caliphate's intellectual dominance. At the time, Baghdad was the epicenter of science, philosophy, mathematics, and engineering. The House of Wisdom, the famed library and research center, was translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon ancient knowledge. Europe, by contrast, was still recovering from the cultural hangover of the post-Roman collapse. Harun's clock wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a time bomb for European self-esteem. And Harun knew the power of appearances. His court was filled with astronomers, physicians, poets, and inventors. He entertained guests with feats of engineering and demonstrations of scientific marvels. His gifts to foreign rulers were carefully curated to provoke awe and perhaps just a touch of inferiority. As for the clock itself, no one knows exactly what became of it. Some believe it was dismantled, others say it broke. It may have simply rusted away, its genius forgotten in the folds of history. But the message endured. Harun al-Rashid understood that magic and science, in the eyes of the unprepared, are indistinguishable. His gift wasn't meant to be practical. It was theatrical diplomacy, a reminder that power isn't just about armies or gold. Sometimes it's about building something so clever your enemies aren't even sure if it's real. And in the shadows of these marvels, a different kind of obsession was brewing, one that turned away from invention and toward the stars. Or rather, the moon. Because the next king didn't want machines or floating palaces. He wanted the moon god, all to himself. King Nabonidus of Babylon, obsessed with the moon god, neglected the empire. The final king of Babylon didn't fall in battle. He didn't die in a coup. He didn't get assassinated or dethroned in the middle of the night. No, Nabonidus simply wandered off, stared at the moon, and forgot to come back. He ruled in the 6th century BCE, at a time when Babylon was one of the most powerful cities on earth, a hub of trade, culture, and divine ego. Kings before him had worshipped the high god Marduk, as was traditional. Marduk had temples, priests, festivals, rituals, and more theological paperwork than most deities could hope to read in a lifetime. You did not ignore Marduk. It wasn't just blasphemous, it was politically suicidal. Unless you were Nabonidus. Because Nabonidus had a favorite. His name was Sin, the moon god, not a moral judgment. And Nabonidus didn't just worship him in private. He made Sin the central deity of state affairs, elevating him above Marduk, and in doing so, effectively rewrote the empire's cosmic pecking order. The people were confused. The priesthood of Marduk was furious, but Nabonidus wasn't listening. He had packed up and left Babylon altogether, retreating to a distant desert oasis called Tema in what is now Saudi Arabia. There, he built a temple to Sin, engaged in long solitary rituals, and essentially ghosted his own empire for 10 years. That's not a metaphor. The king of Babylon, ruler of the known world, overlord of Mesopotamian civilization, left the capital and didn't come back for a decade. Imagine a president deciding to move to a quiet cabin and spend 10 years watching the moon rise while refusing to answer any calls. Meanwhile, the empire had to keep functioning. Trade continued. Wars needed to be fought. Taxes collected. But the king was watching lunar phases. In his absence, his son Belshazzar served as co-regent, awkwardly trying to keep the royal bureaucracy alive. He hosted festivals in Marduk's name to keep the peace. But everyone knew who the real king was and where he wasn't. Eventually, Nabonidus did return, but the damage had been done. Babylon's elite saw him as a heretic. The priesthood rejected his religious reforms. And most importantly, Persia, under the command of Cyrus the Great, saw an opportunity. When Cyrus invaded in 539 BCE, he was greeted as a liberator. The Babylonians, fed up with Nabonidus' neglect and his cult of sin, opened the gates without much resistance. Nabonidus was captured, exiled, and vanished from history. Babylon was absorbed into the Persian Empire, just like that. And what became of Sin? His temples fell into disuse. His name, once engraved in royal proclamations, faded into the dust. Nabonidus reminds us that ruling is not just about power, it's about presence. You can be the king, the prophet, the chosen of the moon itself, but if you walk away from your people, eventually, they'll stop waiting for you to come back. Of course, some rulers didn't walk away from their cities. They built them, carefully, paranoidly, in perfect circles, not for art but so they could see you coming. Caliph Al-Mansur, Abbasid, built Baghdad in a circle to watch for assassins. In the 8th century, power wasn't just displayed, it was engineered. And few people understood that better than Caliph Al-Mansur, the second ruler of the Abbasid Caliphate and the founder of its most enduring symbol, Baghdad. But unlike the organic sprawl of most ancient cities, Baghdad was no accident. It was a blueprint of fear. When Al-Mansur envisioned his capital, he didn't imagine a city. He imagined a fortress, a circle, perfectly round, walled, and watchful. Historians call it the Round City, and for good reason. Baghdad was constructed as a literal circle, a geometric masterpiece with concentric rings of buildings, defensive barriers, and tightly controlled gates. You couldn't just walk into this city. You had to be seen. Why a circle? Partly for symbolism. Circles were considered divine, representing unity, eternity, and perfection. But mostly, it was about control. Al-Mansur was not a trusting man. He had survived revolts, assassination attempts, and internal coups. He didn't just want to rule from Baghdad, he wanted to see everything coming before it got there. At the center of the city sat the Golden Gate Palace and the Great Mosque. From there, roads radiated outward like spokes on a wheel, dividing the city into quadrants. Residential zones, markets, military barracks, all precisely placed. Surveillance wasn't an afterthought. It was urban planning. Al-Mansur filled the city with guards. Anyone entering or exiting was monitored. Outsiders could be watched before they got close. Ambassadors were scrutinized. Spies were expected. The architecture made the paranoia tangible. It was the medieval equivalent of putting security cameras on every street corner, except the camera was the design itself. Despite its cold logic, Baghdad quickly flourished. Scholars arrived from every corner of the Islamic world. Libraries grew. Debates raged. The city became a beacon of intellectual life. But the original design always lingered in the background, a reminder that knowledge and fear often share the same address. Al-Mansur was no romantic. He didn't build Baghdad for the view. He built it to survive. And in that, he succeeded. The Abbasid Caliphate lasted for centuries, and Baghdad would go on to become one of the most influential cities in human history. But its founding story isn't one of inspiration. It's one of calculation. And what better setting for the next monarch, who didn't need walls to protect himself because he believed he was the divine, not chosen by the gods, not a messenger, but a living God himself, the kind you couldn't question without risking your soul. Shah Ismail, Persia, claimed divine powers and forced subjects to worship him. Every empire has its founding myth, a story wrapped in fire, blood, and the unshakable belief that the person at the top was chosen by something higher. But Shah Ismail the Persia didn't stop at being chosen. He claimed to be the divine. In 1501, Ismail, only 14 years old, rose to power and founded the Safavid dynasty. He swept through Persia with the speed and charisma of a revolutionary prophet, uniting fragmented territories under one fiery banner, Twelver Shia Islam. But this wasn't just a religious shift. It was a total transformation of Persian identity, spiritual, political, and personal. And Ismail wasn't just its architect, he was its living embodiment. He claimed he had been appointed by God, descended from the Prophet Muhammad himself through the revered line of Imams, and therefore infallible, not divinely inspired, but divine. His poetry, written in both Azerbaijani and Persian, declared his heavenly status. His sermons left little room for interpretation. If you lived under his rule, you didn't merely respect the Shah, you were expected to venerate him. His loyal followers, known as the Qizilbash, took this literally. They viewed him not only as a king but as a sacred being. In battle, they fought like zealots, not soldiers. His name was a war cry. His face, to many, was the face of God. And for those who didn't agree, well, they didn't stay around long enough to write dissenting poems. Ismail's spiritual mandate came with an iron will. He enforced the state religion with a brutal intensity that reshaped the region. Sunni Islam, which had dominated Persia for centuries, was swiftly suppressed. Mosques were converted. Religious leaders were exiled or silenced. Public rituals were mandated to reflect the Shah's version of theology. If history was a narrative, Ismail was its editor, and every line had to praise him. He even inserted his own name into the Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, placing himself in the liturgical structure as a divine figure. Imagine rewriting scripture in real time and expecting the entire population to read from the new script daily. What makes Ismail's reign so fascinating isn't just his audacity, but how effectively it worked. Within a single generation, he rewired Persian religious identity. The Shia-Sunni divide that still defines much of the modern Middle East, Ismail drew that line with fire, sword, and sermon. Yet beneath the divine facade was a young man scarred by war and trauma. He had been orphaned, raised in hiding, and conditioned from childhood to see himself as a messianic figure. His delusions weren't vanity, they were a form of survival. In time, Ismail mellowed. After suffering a major military defeat at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, his aura of invincibility shattered. He withdrew from public life, drank heavily, and abandoned much of his earlier messianic fervor. But the world he had created, a theocratic monarchy with divine pretensions, endured. He died in 1524, having ruled for just over 2 decades, but the system he built lasted for centuries. And from the divine to the absurd, the next caliph didn't demand worship. He just wanted his giraffe to be treated with the same respect as a senior court official. Caliph Al-Aziz Billah, Fatimid, treated his pet giraffe like royalty. In the annals of royal absurdity, where entire wars have been launched over dinner, insults and whole cities have been moved to improve a view, Caliph Al-Aziz Billah's reign might seem almost wholesome. His great offense to decorum? He gave his pet giraffe the royal treatment. Ruling the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt from 975 to 996, Al-Aziz was generally seen as a competent and even progressive monarch. He supported religious tolerance, built hospitals, and funded learning institutions. But what history remembers, or at least chuckles at, is the giraffe. The creature was a gift, likely from a trading partner in sub-Saharan Africa. In an era when most people's concept of wildlife didn't extend beyond camels and cats, a giraffe was nothing short of mythical. Long-necked, oddly gentle, and impossibly tall, it wasn't just an animal, it was a living miracle. And Al-Aziz was enchanted. He didn't confine the giraffe to a menagerie. No, he made it part of court life. It was fed from golden bowls. It had its own attendants. It was dressed, yes, dressed in embroidered fabrics on ceremonial occasions. Some records suggest the giraffe was allowed to roam the palace grounds freely, its towering silhouette becoming a familiar figure in the gardens of Cairo. Officials were instructed to treat the animal with dignity. Courtiers bowed to it, either as a joke or by royal decree. One diplomat from Byzantium noted, with amusement or concern, that the giraffe was more honored than many ministers. Why the obsession? Perhaps because the giraffe was a symbol. In an empire that prized cosmopolitan sophistication, the giraffe embodied exotic power, a kind of natural diplomacy. It showed the world that Egypt wasn't just strong, but worldly, wealthy, and wonderfully eccentric. But there's another layer. Al-Aziz's elevation of the giraffe wasn't just spectacle. It was a subtle political signal. He ruled a diverse empire. Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted uneasily under Fatimid rule. His treatment of the giraffe, an outsider given privilege, a stranger-turned courtier, reflected a broader policy of inclusion. If a giraffe could dine from a golden dish, then perhaps tolerance was possible. Of course, not everyone was charmed. Some clerics and bureaucrats found the giraffe embarrassing. Feeding it from sacred vessels? Giving it an escort through city streets? Surely that was pushing it. But Al-Aziz didn't care. His giraffe was more than a pet, it was a statement. He died in 996, and his successors had less patience for four-legged diplomacy. The giraffe faded from records, and court life returned to its usual rhythms of poetry, paranoia, and power struggles. But for a brief moment in history, one animal stood taller than the rest, literally and figuratively. And while Al-Aziz's giraffe dined in peace, the next caliph kept a different kind of company. Female performers in disguise, forbidden by law, but welcomed in secret. Caliph Al-Hadi, Abbasid, banned women from singing in court, but secretly enjoyed their performances. There's hypocrisy. And then there's empire-grade hypocrisy, the kind that's carved into law while being quietly ignored behind velvet curtains. Caliph Al-Hadi of the Abbasid dynasty ruled briefly in the late 8th century, and though his time on the throne was short, it was long enough to reveal a very specific kind of contradiction. The performance of morality for public approval, and the quiet staging of its opposite for personal pleasure. Al-Hadi came to power in 785, inheriting a flourishing Islamic empire that stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. His predecessor, Al-Mahdi, also his father, had solidified the Abbasid grip on power and institutionalized much of the empire's court culture, which included music, poetry, and yes, women performers. Female singers, known as Qiyan, had long played a role in elite entertainment, trained not just in music, but in literature, etiquette, and conversation. They were prized for their talent and intellect as much as their beauty, and they were staples of royal salons. Al-Hadi, however, wanted to project a more austere image. As part of his moral reforms, he declared that women should not be permitted to sing in the royal court. It was improper, he claimed, unbecoming of an Islamic caliphate. The ban was meant to signal piety, to show that the empire would no longer tolerate decadence, and to set the tone for a more serious era of governance. But it didn't last long, because Al-Hadi, for all his public morality, had private preferences. Behind closed doors, he continued to summon the very performers he had outlawed. Only now, they were disguised, often masked, or dressed as male musicians to avoid the appearance of impropriety. It was a farce everyone in the court understood. Ministers looked the other way. Eunuchs arranged the logistics. And the music played on, echoing softly down the marble halls of power, while the official record remained silent. Some accounts suggest that Al-Hadi even wrote poetry for his favorite performers, praising their voices and cleverness under pseudonyms, of course. One particularly ironic verse supposedly describes a woman whose song shames the lyre and humbles the nightingale, written just months after he had publicly condemned such performances. Why the double standard? Likely the usual reasons: the need to maintain authority, the pressure to appeal to religious scholars, and the fear of being seen as soft or indulgent. Al-Hadi was young, only in his 20s, and still establishing his legitimacy. Outlawing courtly pleasures gave the appearance of strength. Quietly indulging them allowed him to remain human. His reign ended abruptly. He died under mysterious circumstances in 786, just a year after taking the throne. Rumors swirled: illness, poisoning, conspiracy. His brother, Harun al-Rashid, succeeded him and restored music to the court in full glory, no disguises necessary. Al-Hadi is a footnote in Abbasid history, but a revealing one. His short rule captured a truth that echoes across time: that public virtue and private desire often live side by side, separated only by a curtain and a convenient lie. And speaking of curtains, the next ruler didn't need music or company, just a daily dose of mercury pills, swallowed in pursuit of eternal life and death by slow, glittering poison. Emperor Qin Shi Huang consumed mercury pills for immortality. Qin Shi Huang didn't want to rule China. He wanted to outlive it. As the first emperor to unify China in 221 BCE, he wasn't content with simply building an empire. He wanted to conquer death itself. His vision was absolute: a centralized state, a standardized language, a single currency, and an eternal throne. Everything had to be unified, even mortality. He began his reign with relentless focus. Roads were paved, weights and measures recalibrated, and the Great Wall began to rise under his watch. He abolished feudalism, consolidated power, and crushed dissent with merciless efficiency. But as the empire stabilized, another obsession took hold, one deeper than conquest, more seductive than power: the search for immortality. Qin Shi Huang feared death the way other rulers feared rebellion. He dispatched envoys across the known world to seek out elixirs and philosophers, magicians and alchemists. Anyone who claimed to possess the secret to eternal life found a willing patron in the imperial court, and unfortunately for the emperor, some of them did have a potion to offer. It was called cinnabar, a glowing red mineral, rich in mercury, believed to have mystical properties. Alchemists prepared it into pills and tonics, claiming it would preserve the soul and halt decay. Qin swallowed them by the handful, and for a while it may have worked. He remained vigorous, restless, and paranoid. He avoided public appearances, moved frequently between palaces, and built an elaborate system of secret roads so that no one could predict where he might be. Death, he believed, could be outmaneuvered. Meanwhile, construction began on his final masterpiece, the mausoleum complex at Mount Lee, home to the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, and chariots buried underground, ready to serve him in the afterlife. Ironically, the emperor who sought to avoid death built one of the largest tombs in human history, a monument to a fate he refused to accept. But the mercury worked its quiet magic. The symptoms crept in slowly: tremors, confusion, irritability. He became more reclusive, more paranoid, convinced that assassins lurked behind every pillar. When he finally died in 210 BCE during a tour of the empire, his courtiers panicked. Terrified of unrest, they disguised his death for weeks, carrying his body in a carriage packed with rotting fish to mask the smell. The first emperor, who had built so much, could not even control the moment of his own passing. His dynasty crumbled shortly after. The empire he forged lasted only 15 years beyond his death, undone not by rebellion, but by the weight of a vision too massive to sustain. Immortality had eluded him, but legacy accidental and tragic did not. Qin Shi Huang reminds us that the more power you accumulate, the more fragile you often become, and the more you fear death, the more quickly you rush to meet it. And in the palace halls of his successors, another emperor wasn't running from death. He was running from spirits and building entire architectural complexes just to keep them company. Emperor Wu of Han built palaces to house exorcists. Power invites paranoia, and Emperor Wu of Han had more than his fair share of both. Ruling from 141 to 87 BCE, he presided over one of the most expansive and influential periods in Chinese history. He reformed government, opened the Silk Road, and turned the Han dynasty into a superpower. But beneath the layers of legacy and military brilliance was a ruler haunted by forces no army could defeat. Ghosts. Yes, literal ghosts. Wu believed he was under supernatural attack, stalked by malevolent spirits, hexed by sorcerers, and targeted by unseen enemies in the spirit realm. In response, he didn't just consult shamans, he built them houses. Multiple ones. These weren't humble meditation huts. They were full-scale palace complexes designed to host Taoist priests and exorcists, furnished with everything a well-paid spiritual specialist might need to do battle with demons. Think imperial architecture, but make it esoteric. Altars instead of thrones. Incense smoke instead of royal decrees. The emperor spared no expense. He invited hundreds of occult practitioners to court, commissioning rituals, potions, and amulets to ward off evil. He believed his enemies were using wugu, a kind of sorcery involving poisons and spirits, and that only constant spiritual cleansing could protect him. Entire rituals were developed specifically for his protection. Some required music, others chanting, and more than a few involved burning very expensive things in very public places. To outsiders, it was baffling. Here was a man who ruled a vast empire, negotiated with foreign kingdoms, and commanded the respect of his contemporaries, utterly convinced that invisible beings were trying to kill him. But in the context of ancient China, Wu's fears weren't seen as delusions. They were seen as spiritual sensitivity. The emperor wasn't weak. He was in touch with higher realms. Eventually, his obsession with the occult took a darker turn. Paranoia about witches and ghost plots led to purges at court. Accusations of sorcery became death sentences. Ministers vanished. Even members of his own family weren't spared. The palace began to resemble a haunted house in more ways than one, filled with exorcists by day and silent disappearances by night. And yet, the empire kept functioning. Wu's administrators were competent, his generals were effective, the economy expanded, all while the emperor quietly tried to banish ghosts from the rafters of his throne room. He died in 87 BCE, exhausted by a life of ambition, ritual, and supernatural warfare. His successor would scale back the mysticism and restore some semblance of rational order, but the ghost palaces remained, strange monuments to a ruler who tried to govern both heaven and earth. And while Wu of Han built temples to keep phantoms at bay, the next emperor dug canals not for trade or agriculture, but so his royal yacht could glide across the empire, like a floating crown. Emperor Yang of Sui dug a personal canal for his pleasure yachts. If ever there were a man who saw his empire as a backdrop for his own luxury cruise, it was Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty. He reigned from 604 to 618 CE, and while most monarchs were content with riding horses or being carried in sedan chairs, Yang had a different vision. He wanted to sail everywhere. But China, as it turns out, is not one giant river. So Yang decided to fix that. His solution? Construct the Grand Canal, one of the largest and most ambitious infrastructure projects in history. Officially, it was built to transport grain, connect the empire, and streamline commerce between the north and south. Unofficially, it was also designed so the emperor could float between cities in extravagant, multi-tiered yachts without ever having to touch a road. Yang's personal barge was less a boat and more a floating palace. It had multiple decks, banquet halls, sleeping chambers, pavilions, and an onboard orchestra. Some accounts claim it was crewed by thousands, including rowers, musicians, chefs, and entertainers. As the ship passed through villages, it left in its wake not just ripples but astonishment and sometimes financial ruin. Entire towns were expected to stage elaborate welcoming ceremonies along the canal's banks, often at their own expense. The emperor treated these journeys as divine processions. He was not traveling, he was being revealed. One might even say the canal wasn't just for water, it was for worship. But behind the pomp was a staggering human cost. The construction of the Grand Canal required the forced labor of millions. The toll in lives was enormous, though exact numbers remain debated. Workers died from exhaustion, disease, and poor conditions. Entire provinces were drained of manpower, all so that one man could sail from palace to palace in unprecedented comfort. And yet, despite its origins, the Grand Canal proved to be a critical artery in China's economic and administrative structure for centuries to come, a legacy born of vanity that became a tool of unification. Emperor Yang, in a way, accidentally gifted his successors the infrastructure they actually needed in the middle of trying to build a luxury waterway for his ego. Unsurprisingly, the emperor's indulgences didn't sit well with everyone. His lavish spending, military failures, and general disregard for the peasantry sparked widespread rebellion. In 618, he was assassinated by his own officials. The Sui dynasty collapsed shortly after. But the canal remained a permanent monument to the strange duality of power, that sometimes the most useful legacies are built not from vision, but from vanity. And while Yang's barge glided through rivers, the next emperor was drifting further and further into artistic obsession, painting flowers, while losing his empire to invaders. Emperor Huizong of Song, obsessed with painting, while losing his empire. If you've ever heard the phrase fiddling while Rome burns, meet the Chinese equivalent, though in this case, the emperor was painting cranes while the borders collapsed. Emperor Huizong of the Song dynasty, who reigned from 1100 to 1126 CE, was not a bad man. He was just the wrong man to be holding a paintbrush when he should have been holding a sword. Huizong was a patron of the arts to the point of obsession. He revolutionized Chinese calligraphy, curated vast imperial art collections, and developed a signature painting style that's still admired today. He elevated painting to a near-sacred status. His imperial court wasn't just a place of governance, it was an open studio. Artists were hired, nurtured, and even ranked. Poetry was published, gardens were sculpted, and Huizong himself dabbled in everything from composing music to designing furniture. His favorite subject? Birds and flowers, particularly cranes. Under Huizong, art became governance, or at least replaced it. He poured vast resources into the Academy of Painting, where he personally critiqued student work and debated aesthetic theory, while military reports stacked up unread on his desk. Even his calligraphy had a name: Slender Gold. It was beautiful, delicate, and almost painfully impractical, much like his rule. Meanwhile, just beyond the walls of this watercolor utopia, the Jurchen-led Qin dynasty was preparing to invade. The northern territories of China were under threat. Alliances were collapsing, and his generals were either ignored or replaced with more culturally refined candidates. One famously loyal commander was demoted because he offended a poet at court. Another was dismissed for having handwriting deemed too vulgar for official correspondence. As the Qin forces advanced, Huizong finally began to take notice, but only just. In a panic, he abdicated the throne in 1,126 inches favor of his son, hoping the change would buy time. It didn't. The following year, the Qin sacked the Song capital of Kaifeng, captured Huizong, his son, and thousands of members of the imperial family. They were forced to march north into captivity. In exile, Huizong continued to paint. He died a decade later, not as an emperor, but as a prisoner, still composing poems, still drawing birds, still living in a world far removed from the empire he had once ruled. His artworks, ironically, survived better than his dynasty. Today, his paintings are considered national treasures, serene, masterful depictions of nature from a man who couldn't protect his own borders. Huizong reminds us that beauty, no matter how sublime, can't stop an invasion, and sometimes a brushstroke is just a distraction from the sound of approaching footsteps. Speaking of footsteps, the next ruler heard them too, not from enemies, but from inside his own palace, where his own son was pacing, paranoid, and soon to be locked in a rice chest. King Yongzhou of Joseon locked his own son in a rice chest. Few royal stories are as claustrophobic or tragic as that of King Yongzhou of Joseon and his doomed son, Crown Prince Sado. In the 18th century, Korea's royal court was a place of Confucian formality, ritualized obedience, and silent resentment, an environment where emotional volatility was considered a political threat. Yongzhou was a disciplined monarch. He ruled for over 50 years with remarkable stability, implemented important reforms, and is still regarded as one of Korea's most competent kings. But his obsession with order, propriety, and the moral perfection of Confucian kingship clashed fatally with the psychological instability of his son. Sado, the crown prince, was different from the start. By most accounts, he was intelligent but erratic, creative but increasingly volatile. Modern historians have suggested he may have suffered from severe mental illness, though such diagnoses are speculative. What is clear is that Sado struggled, and the royal court was a terrible place to struggle. His behavior grew increasingly disturbing, and his presence at court became a source of discomfort, even fear. Servants avoided him, ministers whispered. His father, Yongzhou, watched with growing horror as the heir to the throne unraveled in full view of the dynasty's highest officials. But Yongzhou was trapped. To dethrone a crown prince was a public admission of dynastic failure. To execute one was even worse. And so, in 1762, the king devised a compromise that was neither legal nor humane. He ordered Sado confined in a wooden rice chest, a large, sealed box used to store grain, and left him there in the summer heat. It was a political solution disguised as familial mercy. Sado could not be executed outright without inviting scandal, but if he died accidentally, there was no legal stain, so the chest remained shut, and the court remained silent. Sado died after several days inside, His death was not announced with drama or outrage. It was recorded with bureaucratic precision, a royal inconvenience resolved through suffocation and silence. His wife and son, the future King Yongzhou, survived, but bore the weight of that legacy for the rest of their lives. In later years, Yongzhou was haunted by the decision. He justified it publicly as necessary for the stability of the state, but in private, he reportedly grieved deeply. He never allowed the name Sado to be spoken aloud again in his presence. The story of King Yongzhou and Prince Sado has remained one of Korea's most painful royal tragedies, not because of overt cruelty, but because of the quiet calculation behind it. A king so obsessed with order that he turned his son into an unspeakable secret. And as we move east across the sea, we find another royal figure, not a king, but a queen who spoke not with decrees or punishment, but with spirits. A woman who claimed her entire rule was directed by voices from beyond. Queen Himiko, Yamatai, Japan, ruled through spirit possession. In the misty prehistory of Japan, when myths, politics, and oral traditions blurred into one long, dreamlike narrative, there emerged a queen unlike any other queen, Himiko of Yamatai. Her name means sunchild or sun-daughter, but her reputation rested not on sunshine, but on shadows. She is believed to have ruled during the 3rd century CE, though records are sparse and inconsistent, written more by her enemies and neighbors than by her own people. The Chinese historical text, Weiji, part of the records of the Three Kingdoms, is one of the few surviving sources to mention her. According to it, Himiko was a shaman queen, a ruler not just by bloodline, but by supernatural authority. She never married. She rarely appeared in public. She spoke through intermediaries. Her commands were said to be passed on by male officials, while she remained secluded in a tower surrounded by hundreds of female attendants. The reason? She claimed her body was inhabited by spirits, powerful ones, and the people believed her. In an era where chaos and tribal warfare dominated, Himiko offered order divine, mysterious, and unchallengeable. Her spiritual legitimacy gave her more control than any sword ever could. She performed rituals to maintain harmony between her people and the gods, and it's said that her rule brought a period of unusual peace to the region. This wasn't rule by force, it was rule by the unseen. To foreign powers, she was equally enigmatic. The Chinese court recognized her as the ruler of Wa, an early name for Japan, and sent her gifts and titles. But even then, her emissaries carried her words. She never left her spiritual sanctum. Political negotiations were conducted through ritualized intermediaries, reinforcing the image of a queen who wasn't quite earthly. Some historians argue that Himiko was a symbolic figure, a title held by successive female shamans. Others believe she was a real historical person whose power stemmed not just from divine performance, but from genuine political strategy. After all, claiming to channel the gods is a remarkably effective way to end debates. And in a culture where animism and ancestral worship were the norm, spiritual authority wasn't just persuasive, it was law. After her death, chaos returned. Rival clans fought for power, and the people, according to Chinese accounts, begged for another female ruler like Himiko. Eventually, a younger woman, possibly a relative named Iyo, was installed to restore order, suggesting that even in death, Himiko's brand of ghost-guided governance had staying power. She may not have written laws or waged wars, but Queen Himiko ruled a kingdom where the line between voice and vessel was deliberately unclear. And whether she was possessed by spirits or by political genius, she remains one of history's most haunting examples of power that needed no sword, crown, or even spoken word to command obedience. But where Himiko channeled fox spirits and ancestral ghosts in whispers and rituals, the next emperor encountered something far more personal, foxes of another kind, chasing him through dreams, leaving him wondering whether his mind was a scroll of divine prophecy or something far stranger. Emperor Nijo. Japan kept diaries about being chased by fox spirits. Among the emperors of Japan, Emperor Nijo is often forgotten, and perhaps that's how he preferred it. He ruled briefly in the 12th century, in a period of transition and shadowy court politics. His reign was short and largely ceremonial, but his inner world, that was something else entirely. Nijo didn't leave behind declarations or legendary battles. He left behind diaries, highly detailed, deeply personal, and thoroughly bizarre. The Gyokuyo, his court diary, is one of the strangest windows into imperial psychology ever produced, because in its pages, Nijo documented not policies or war councils, but dreams. And not just dreams erotic, unsettling, otherworldly dreams, featuring fox spirits. Yes, kitsune. In Japanese folklore, these shape-shifting foxes are tricksters and seducers, often portrayed as messengers of the gods or spirits of deep cunning. They're said to possess people, disguise themselves as beautiful women, and lead the unsuspecting into confusion, temptation, or madness. For Emperor Nijo, they were nightly visitors, beautiful, menacing, and inescapable. He recorded these encounters in obsessive detail. In one entry, he described being pursued through a moonlit garden by a woman whose eyes glowed like coals, only to discover her foxtail swaying beneath her robes. In another, he claimed to have been seduced in a dream, then awakened to find bite marks on his skin. He wondered aloud whether these experiences were divine visions, warnings, or symptoms of spiritual corruption. His tone was never humorous. It was reverent and slightly terrified. The court didn't exactly dismiss his writings, but they didn't publicize them either. Japan's imperial family was supposed to embody kokutai, the sacred essence of national continuity. An emperor chased by foxes in his dreams, that didn't exactly sell confidence. And yet, these diary entries are among the richest surviving records of Heian period dream culture. In that era, dreams were not just subconscious musings, they were seen as messages from the spirit world, carrying implications for both personal and political destiny. The idea that an emperor could be hunted by fox spirits wasn't necessarily madness, it was cosmology. Nijo's fox dreams coincided with a time of increasing power for the samurai class and the declining influence of the imperial court. Some scholars suggest the foxes represented his anxiety that he felt hunted not by supernatural beings, but by history itself. Others take the accounts more literally, viewing them as reflections of the court's obsession with omens, portents, and dream divination. Whatever the case, Nijo left behind something rare, not the facade of royalty, but the raw, unguarded self of a man uncertain whether the world that terrified him was real or imagined. A man who ruled in daylight and ran from spirits in the dark, and where Nijo's nightly fox chases haunted his sleep, the next emperor's waking life was haunted by blood, remorse, and a staggering transformation, one that began with a massacre and ended with a vow of peace, gold, and penance. Emperor Ashoka. From massacre to Buddhism and annual weigh-ins with gold. Before he was remembered as Ashoka the Great, the model Buddhist king who renounced violence and championed compassion, he was something very different. A prince of blood and ambition, a man whose rise to power was paved with crushed resistance and silenced rivals. The early years of his reign were not shaped by meditations under fig trees, but by sieges, fire, and conquest. Ashoka ascended to the Mauryan throne around 268 BCE, and early on, he proved to be a ruler who understood power in its rawest form. But the defining moment of his transformation and of his rule came with the brutal campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga. It was a large-scale military operation, the kind that had been normalized in the ancient world. Except Ashoka didn't normalize it, not after he saw the results. According to his own inscriptions, some of the oldest surviving royal proclamations in the world, Ashoka was so horrified by the suffering he witnessed that he experienced a profound personal crisis. The emperor who had wielded swords suddenly found himself disarmed by sorrow. The bodies weren't just casualties, they were citizens, and in a rare moment for ancient autocrats, he didn't hide the remorse. He carved it in stone for all to read. From that moment, Ashoka took a dramatic turn both politically and spiritually. He embraced Buddhism, renounced future wars of aggression, and began a sweeping campaign to govern through Dhamma, or moral law. This wasn't a quiet, personal conversion. It was a state-level rebranding. Pillars were erected across the empire, inscribed with his edicts: be kind, be tolerant, protect animals, support monks. The man who had once ordered executions now banned them at festivals. And then came the weigh-ins. Each year, Ashoka had himself weighed against gold, not for vanity, but as a ritual of humility and charity. Whatever the total weight, that amount of gold was distributed to the poor. It was part moral theater, part public policy. The emperor literally converted into coinage, to remind everyone, including himself, that no ruler is more than his weight in generosity. Ashoka also banned royal hunts, promoted vegetarianism, and sent diplomatic envoys carrying Buddhist teachings as far as Greece and Sri Lanka. The man who once expanded his empire with armies now expanded it with ideas. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some nobles found his compassion inconvenient. Others mocked the emperor's new obsession with monks and animals. Running an empire, after all, required harder edges. Ashoka, however, remained committed. Until his death, he governed like a penitent king, aware of the legacy he was trying to rewrite in real time. And while Ashoka tried to use stone pillars and gold scales to tip the balance of history in his favor, the next king took a very different approach, building observatories not to measure conscience, but to chart the stars, and occasionally to talk to parrots. King Jai Singh II built giant stone observatories and believed in parrot omens. If Ashoka looked inward for enlightenment, King Jai Singh II of Jaipur looked far up into the intricate and mathematically maddening night sky. A scholar king of the 18th century, Jai Singh wasn't content with the usual trappings of monarchy. Crowns and courts were nice, but what really excited him were constellations, comets, and the cold geometry of the cosmos. In an age when many rulers were still commissioning palaces, Jai Singh built Jantar Mantar's vast sculptural observatories made of stone and marble, designed to measure celestial movements with breathtaking precision. The instruments were architectural wonders. Imagine sundials the size of small houses, staircases aligned to planetary inclinations, and towering arcs that cast shadows so exact they made astronomers blush. He didn't build just one, he built 5. Delhi, Jaipur, Ujjain, Mathura, and Varanasi all received these cosmic monuments, each acting as both scientific center and public spectacle. Visitors didn't just observe the tools, they walked through them. Giant sextants loomed like modernist sculptures. Every inch was calculated, every angle mattered. But for all his obsession with mathematical precision, Jai Singh still had room in his heart and his court for omens, especially the ones delivered by parrots. Yes, parrots. While the king tracked the movement of Mars, he also kept a flock of birds whose squawks and behaviors were believed to carry messages from the divine. Some were trained to repeat auspicious phrases. Others were observed during council meetings, their cries interpreted like tea leaves with feathers. If a parrot flew in the wrong direction before a military campaign, plans could be delayed. If it squawked at the wrong noble, well, maybe that noble should be watched more closely. This paradox, the hyper-scientific astronomer who also trusted bird omens, wasn't considered strange at the time. In Jai Singh's worldview, reason and mysticism weren't opposing forces. They were twin tools in a ruler's kit. He could chart lunar eclipses with jaw-dropping accuracy and still believe that the gods sometimes sent messages on wings. He also dabbled in philosophy, architecture, and even politics, though his astronomical projects often took precedence. Some contemporaries grumbled that his priorities were skewed, that he focused too much on stars and not enough on statecraft. But Jaipur flourished under his rule. The city became a center for learning, trade, and science. The Jantar Mantar in Jaipur remains a UNESCO World Heritage Site to this day. Jai Singh died in 1743, leaving behind a legacy that was part ruler, part stargazer, part parrot whisperer. A man who believed that understanding the heavens might just help him understand the chaos below. And while Jai Singh's falcons and parrots circled peacefully under the stars, the next emperor took birds to a much darker extreme, training them not to sing, but to hunt and bring him living prey. Mughal Emperor Jahangir trained falcons to hunt and bring back live prey. In the grand lineage of the Mughal emperors, Jahangir stands out not just for his taste in art, architecture, and Persian poetry, but for his unwavering fascination with animals, specifically birds that could hunt like warriors and perform like courtiers. Jahangir ruled from 1605 to 1627, inheriting the empire from his father Akbar the Great and maintaining a relatively stable, prosperous realm. But while his military conquests were limited, his imagination roamed wide, especially when it came to birds of prey. He didn't merely keep falcons. He trained them with the precision of a general and the obsession of a craftsman. Falconry was already an established royal pastime in Mughal India, a sport of kings stretching back through Persian and Central Asian traditions. But Jahangir took it further. His falcons weren't just trained to hunt animals, they were trained to return them alive. He wanted his prey intact, squirming, delivered like an imperial offering. The process was both delicate and dramatic. Falcons were hand-reared, their diets controlled, their temperaments shaped through patient conditioning. They responded to specific calls, performed intricate maneuvers, and were expected to capture deer, rabbits, and even cranes without killing them. It was the aerial version of a royal arrest. For Jahangir, this wasn't merely entertainment, it was metaphor. A living animal captured from the wild, delivered without bloodshed, was the perfect symbol of imperial control, domination without destruction, elegance with power. The falcons were extensions of his will-winged enforcers that flattered his authority every time they swooped in for a catch. He kept meticulous records of his avian regiments. In his personal memoirs, the Tuzk-i Jahangiri, he wrote at length about individual birds, praising their behavior, their style, even their moods. Some received names, jeweled hoods, and elaborate funerals when they died. More than a few nobles grumbled that the emperor seemed more emotionally invested in his birds than in his bureaucracy. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. While Jahangir was capable of decisive leadership, he often delegated governance to his wife, Nur Jahan, a brilliant strategist in her own right, while he roamed the gardens of his palaces, whispering to birds and sketching flora. His court became a kind of naturalist salon, filled with exotic animals, rare specimens, and elaborate paintings documenting every feather and claw. His love for animals extended beyond falcons. He issued decrees protecting certain species, banned unnecessary killing, and reportedly once ordered a bird physician, yes, a bird physician to be sent to a neighboring kingdom after hearing of a royal parrot's illness. Diplomacy, but make it avian. Jahangir died in 1627, leaving behind a stable empire and thousands of illustrations of the natural world: birds mid-flight, animals mid-pounce, empires mid-balance. His falcons outlived him, at least symbolically. They remained perched in the art, in the memoirs, in the imagination of an emperor who believed the most beautiful power was the kind that could catch life without taking it. But while Jahangir romanticized nature, the next ruler tried to become it, declaring himself the sun's chosen prophet, and banning every god but the one that looked back at him in the mirror. Pharaoh Akhenaten, Egypt, declared the sun Diskaten, the only god. In a land defined by polytheism, gods of the Nile, gods of fertility, gods of death and rebirth, Pharaoh Akhenaten did the unthinkable. He told Egypt to pick just one. He ruled during the 14th century BCE, and for most of his early reign, he followed the usual script of divine kingship. Temples were built, gods were honored, rituals were performed. But at some point, Akhenaten, then known as Amenhotep IV, looked up at the sun and decided he'd had enough of all the other gods. He renamed himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declared that the sun disk, Aten, was the sole deity worthy of worship. This wasn't just a religious tweak, it was a full-scale theological revolution. Temples to Amun, Osiris, and Thoth were shut down or defunded. Priesthoods lost their influence. Old rituals were banned. In their place, Akhenaten built an entirely new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, dedicated solely to Aten. Gone were the towering statues of gods in animal form. Instead, there were open courtyards flooded with sunlight, filled with carvings of Akhenaten and his family, bathed in the rays of the Aten, depicted as a golden disk with hands extending downward like divine rays offering Ankh, the breath of life. Akhenaten didn't just centralize religion, he personalized it. The sun no longer needed temples, it had him. He and his queen, the famously elegant Nefertiti, became the exclusive intermediaries between Aten and the people. No priests, no myths, just a royal couple glowing with divine light. The change was radical and deeply unpopular. Common Egyptians, long accustomed to a pantheon of approachable deities, gods for farmers, gods for funerals, gods for everything, suddenly found themselves shut out. The elite priesthood, once politically powerful, was sidelined. Traditional festivals disappeared. And although the Aten cult was visually beautiful, all golden light and graceful iconography, it lacked the comforting mythologies that anchored Egyptian spiritual life. Akhenaten's art style changed too, gone were the rigid, muscular statues of past pharaohs. In their place, elongated faces, wide hips, narrow torsos. Akhenaten is depicted with androgynous features, as if physically embodying the divine completeness of Aten. Some scholars believe this was symbolic, others think it was a real depiction. Either way, it was a break from everything Egypt had seen before. After Akhenaten's death, the experiment collapsed almost overnight. His son, a boy you might have heard of, named Tutankhamun, reversed the reforms, reopened the temples, and moved the capital back to Thebes. Akhenaten was posthumously condemned. His city was abandoned, his name erased from official records. But his legacy endured, if only in the eerie reminder of how one man tried to reshape a religion, a nation, and an identity using nothing but sunlight and a single god's golden glare. And while Akhenaten basked in the glory of his personal deity, the next pharaoh was busy building something far more practical, a fly-catching strategy so inventive it involved honey, nudity, and an unfortunate job posting. Pharaoh Pepi II, Egypt, used honey-covered slaves to keep flies away. Pharaoh Pepi II is best remembered for two things: being one of the longest reigning monarchs in history, possibly ruling Egypt for over 90 years, and having one of the most absurd royal life hacks ever recorded in the ancient world. And while his near century-long grip on the throne is impressive, it's the other part that keeps historians raising their eyebrows. Pepi II hated flies, not disliked hated. To be fair, in ancient Egypt, flies weren't just annoying. They were a sign of decay, disease, and disorder. But while the average person swatted them away with a reed fan, Pepi had a different strategy. He employed slaves whose job was to stand nearby, completely unclothed, covered in honey, to attract the flies away from him. You read that right. In his royal court, the solution to insect annoyance was to turn another human being into a decoy, a walking, sticky, buzzing decoy. As absurd as it sounds today, this wasn't satire. It was considered effective, efficient, and even elegant by royal standards. The pharaoh remained clean and comfortable. Someone else got the swarm. It's a snapshot of ancient luxury at its most surreal, not just wealth and power, but the kind of unchecked privilege that turns minor inconveniences into elaborate human resource assignments. Imagine having such absolute control over your environment that your biggest environmental stressor becomes delegated, not solved, just redirected. Some scholars have debated the veracity of this tale. Was it literal, exaggerated, symbolic? But there's no denying it speaks to the culture of divine kingship in Egypt, where the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but a living god. Gods, after all, don't swat flies. They make lesser beings deal with that. Pepi descended the throne at around age 6 and ruled during the twilight of the Old Kingdom, a time when pyramid building was fading and regional governors were becoming increasingly powerful. His reign was peaceful, but it was also marked by slow administrative decay. Egypt wasn't collapsing, but it was beginning to drift, and Pepi, isolated in palatial comfort, seemed largely unaware. By the end of his reign, the central government was weak. Local officials acted with increasing autonomy. The grand monuments of earlier pharaohs gave way to more modest construction. The divine aura of the king was still upheld, but in practice, it was becoming hollow. Pepi lived long, possibly too long, and his rule became a kind of background noise to Egypt's slow political unraveling. Still, he's remembered, not for warfare, not for diplomacy, not for innovation, but for standing in a perfectly fly-free corridor of a crumbling palace while someone else slick with honey did the swatting for him. And where Pepi II outsourced his discomfort, the next king enforced discomfort as policy, banning affection, intimacy, and desire across his kingdom in a sweeping campaign for discipline that would make even the harshest reformers pause. King Shaka Zulu, Southern Africa, forced celibacy on his kingdom. King Shaka Zulu was not a man of half measures. He didn't rise from obscure tribal beginnings to build one of the most formidable military states in Southern Africa by being soft, subtle, or sentimental. His rule was sharp-edged, physically disciplined, and strategically brutal. But his most personal and bizarre law had nothing to do with battle formations. It had to do with banning love, or at least anything resembling it. During his reign in the early 19th century, Shaka Zulu imposed a strict code of celibacy across much of his kingdom. Young men were forbidden from marrying until they had proven themselves in military service. For women, the rules were even more severe. They were to remain unmarried, untouched, and entirely devoted to the state or face severe consequences. The result was a society where affection was not just discouraged, it was illegal. Why such a policy? Control, mostly. Shaka saw emotional entanglements as distractions. In his mind, a warrior's duty was to the MP, the regiment, not to a sweetheart in a village hut. Romantic loyalties might compromise military obedience. Parenthood might soften the resolve of a soldier. Families created fractures in the state, so he banned them. He enforced the rule with the same intensity he brought to battlefield tactics. Couples caught breaking the law were punished harshly. Entire villages could be disciplined if found complicit. Courting became an act of rebellion. Love songs, once common, went silent. Courtship rituals disappeared. Marriage rates plummeted, and so did birth rates. Of course, the ban wasn't truly universal. Exceptions were made for those in favor, for ceremonial purposes, and likely for Shaka's own inner circle. But as a public policy, celibacy became a weapon part of a larger system of social engineering that turned the Zulu kingdom into a military machine. To the outside world, this looked like madness. But within Shaka's regime, it was rationalized as discipline. The kingdom expanded rapidly under his leadership, absorbing neighboring tribes and unifying territories under a single banner. His military innovations, short stabbing spears, bullhorn formations, high-speed marching drills, made him nearly invincible in combat. But behind that steel-faced efficiency was a kingdom where laughter, flirtation, and family were monitored like contraband. Some historians have interpreted Shaka's celibacy law as the symptom of personal trauma. He never married himself, and his early life was marked by rejection and exile. Others see it as pure statecraft, a way to eliminate the last sources of divided loyalty among his troops. Whatever the motive, the legacy was unmistakable. Shaka didn't just conquer lands, he tried to conquer human nature. And like all rulers who attempt to edit the emotional blueprint of their people, his grip on power eventually slipped. Assassinated by his own half-brothers, his empire soon fragmented, but not before setting the tone for how the world would remember him. And while Shaka stripped love from his kingdom, the next ruler would flood foreign lands with something else entirely: gold. So much of it, in fact, that entire economies trembled under the weight of his generosity. Mansa Musa, Mali Empire, bankrupted regions with gold handouts during pilgrimage. There are wealthy kings, and then there is Mansa Musa, a man so rich that historians struggle to quantify his fortune without sounding like they're describing a fantasy novel. Ruler of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, Musa didn't just have gold, he had the gold. West Africa's legendary reserves of it, to be specific. And when he decided to take a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he didn't travel light. He brought the gold. All of it. The journey was part religious obligation, part royal parade, and part economic earthquake. Musa's caravan reportedly included tens of thousands of attendants, soldiers, servants, musicians, merchants, and, crucially, a massive train of camels laden with sacks of gold dust. The streets of every city he passed through from Cairo to Medina glittered for weeks afterward, not from any official decree, but from the residual shimmer of Musa's generosity. He gave gold to the poor. He gave it to scholars, to merchants, to strangers on the street. In Cairo, he donated so much of it, so rapidly, that the local economy collapsed. Inflation skyrocketed, gold lost its value for over a decade, Prices in markets became meaningless. For the first time in history, an entire region was destabilized, not by war, not by famine, but by wealth. This was, essentially, weaponized generosity. Of course, Musa didn't mean to cause chaos. His pilgrimage was sincere. He was a devout Muslim, and he saw the journey to Mecca as both spiritual fulfillment and an opportunity to place Mali on the world map, literally. European cartographers who had previously never heard of his empire soon began labeling West Africa with the name Mali and placing a golden-crowned king on the throne in their maps. His pilgrimage wasn't just lavish, it was diplomatic. Along the way, he commissioned mosques, met with scholars, and imported architects and artisans back to Timbuktu, which he transformed into a hub of Islamic learning and architecture. The city's Sankore University and Grand Mosque became enduring symbols of his legacy. Still, Musa's most lasting contribution wasn't religious or intellectual, it was economic myth. His wealth, outsized even by modern standards, entered the realm of legend. Centuries later, he would be referenced in obscure Renaissance manuscripts, African oral traditions, and even internet listicles trying to quantify who the richest person in history really was. And yet, the lesson of Mansa Musa isn't just about gold. It's about scale, how too much of a good thing, offered too freely, can break systems instead of enriching them. A king's generosity, when unrestrained, becomes indistinguishable from disruption. And while Musa flooded foreign streets with fortune, the next queen flooded her own dungeons with toxins not to punish or to preserve, but to experiment on human subjects, for science, for strategy, or perhaps just to see what would happen. Cleopatra, 7th, allegedly tested poisons on prisoners. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, has been many things in the historical imagination: seductress, strategist, queen of charm, mistress of Rome. But beneath the layers of perfume and politics, another Cleopatra emerges, one far more clinical, curious, and coldly scientific. According to ancient sources, notably Pliny the Elder, Cleopatra had a deep and unnerving interest in poisons, not as a victim and not just as a potential weapon, but as a subject of experimentation. The theory goes that she conducted tests on condemned prisoners, administering various concoctions and carefully documenting the effects. Not exactly bedtime reading. She reportedly compared the speed of death, the type of suffering caused, and the subtle changes in physiology. Hemlock, strychnine, arsenic, each was evaluated like a courtroom defendant. Cleopatra wanted to know which death was fastest, which pain was sharpest, and which mixture offered the most discretion. After all, if you're the most politically precarious queen in the ancient world, having a quick and subtle exit plan isn't morbid, it's just practical. Her fascination wasn't just academic, it was strategic. Cleopatra's reign was balanced on a diplomatic tightrope between Roman warlords, Egyptian unrest, and her own tenuous claim to power. Poison wasn't just a tool for assassination, it was the ultimate political insurance, a substance you could carry in a ring, administer in a drink, or consume yourself before your enemies arrived. Even her legendary death, supposedly by the bite of an asp, fits neatly into this calculated relationship with toxins. While some historians have challenged the snake story as myth or propaganda, others believe she may have used a faster-acting poison hidden in a hairpin or ointment. The point wasn't how she died, but that she chose it and had likely rehearsed it long before the day arrived. Yet, Cleopatra wasn't just obsessed with death. She was obsessed with control. Her court blended Egyptian mysticism with Greek rationalism. She spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy, and understood the scientific traditions of both her people and her enemies. In that sense, her poison experiments were less about cruelty and more about precision. She wanted to master the art of dying just in case. To modern ears, this sounds monstrous, but in the context of ancient monarchs, it was almost pragmatic. Kings waged war, queens measured outcomes. And Cleopatra, who had seen enough plots and betrayals to fill a dozen operas, preferred her defenses subtle, tasteless, and chemically exact. So while Mansa Musa emptied his kingdom to impress the world, Cleopatra stared at beakers, prisms, and trembling test subjects, not to be admired, but to be prepared. And as she perfected the art of undetectable exits, the next king ruled with far less finesse, throwing subtlety out the palace window and replacing it with ultimatums, obsessions, and one dangerously literal interpretation of palace discipline. King Mwanga II of Buganda executed teenage pages for refusing his advances. By the time Mwanga II ascended the throne of Buganda in 1884, the kingdom was already at a cultural crossroads. Western missionaries were arriving in increasing numbers, introducing not just new religions but new ideas about governance, morality, and what constituted acceptable behavior from a king. Mwanga, however, had his own vision for power, and he did not take well to rejection. He was only 18 when he became Kabaka, inheriting a position both sacred and absolute. In Buganda tradition, the Kabaka was not just a political figure, but a quasi-divine one. His word was law, his desires unquestionable. For centuries, this system had worked, or at least it had been tolerated. But Mwanga ruled at a time when outside scrutiny was growing sharper and internal resistance was beginning to take root. According to contemporary accounts, Mwanga had a particular obsession with control, especially over the young male pages of his royal court. When some of them, newly converted to Christianity, began to refuse his demands and assert their own moral boundaries, Mwanga responded with fury. To be disobeyed was not just offensive, it was heretical. In his eyes, it was a direct challenge to the cosmic hierarchy of power that placed him above all others. What followed was not merely repression, it was escalation. A group of pages, known today as the Uganda Martyrs, were executed for their refusal to submit to the king's authority. Some were burned alive. Others were killed in more private ways. Their deaths sent a message. The Kabaka does not ask, he commands. But the message backfired. Rather than reasserting his dominance, Mwanga's actions galvanized resistance. Christian missionaries and converts, who had previously tried to coexist with the monarchy, began to speak out more forcefully. Foreign powers, particularly the British, saw an opportunity. They framed Mwanga as barbaric, unstable, and in need of civilizing. The executions became propaganda. Within just a few years, Mwanga had alienated almost every faction of his kingdom. He was briefly overthrown, restored, then overthrown again. He converted to Christianity, then recanted. He allied with the British, then rebelled. It was a tragic seesaw of indecision and reactionary cruelty. In the end, the once sacred throne of Buganda was absorbed into the expanding British protectorate. Mwanga died in exile, a king without a kingdom, remembered more for the martyrs he created than for anything he built. And yet, in a grim twist of legacy, those same martyrs were later canonized by the Catholic Church. Today, they are celebrated across Uganda. Their refusal, once considered treason, is now honored as sanctity. And Mwanga, who tried to command the future by force, was left behind in the footnotes of history as a ruler undone not by rebellion or invasion, but by his own inability to hear the word no. And while Mwanga imposed fear through command and retribution, The next king claimed his mandate came not from cruelty or conquest, but from divine construction, carved straight from the earth by the hands of angels. King Lalibela, Ethiopia, claimed angels helped him carve churches from solid rock. In the heart of Ethiopia, where the highlands rise like ancient monuments themselves, lies one of the world's most jaw-dropping architectural mysteries. 11 medieval churches, carved entirely from solid rock, sunken into the earth, connected by tunnels, trenches, and secret passages. They weren't built brick by brick. They were excavated, sculpted from living stone. And the man behind this feat? King Lalibela, or so the legend goes. Ruling during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, King Lalibela was a member of the Zagwe dynasty, a Christian monarch who believed or claimed that he had been divinely tasked with creating a New Jerusalem in Africa. Jerusalem itself had fallen into the hands of Muslim forces during the Crusades, and for Ethiopian Christians, making a sacred replica on their own soil was both an act of devotion and defiance. The churches are extraordinary in both form and concept. From above, they appear like sunken crosses, impossible geometric voids etched into the ground. From below, they are entire sanctuaries, pillars, altars, domes, all carved seamlessly from the same slab of volcanic rock. No mortar, no scaffolding, just impossibly precise subtraction. But the story doesn't end with stone. According to tradition, the king didn't do it alone. At night, after the laborers had gone to rest, angels descended and continued the work. The idea was not metaphorical. It was widely believed. The pace of construction was considered inhuman, too fast, too perfect. Therefore, divine intervention was the only logical explanation. Lalibela himself was seen not just as a ruler, but as a prophet architect, someone whose vision came directly from God. He walked barefoot through the construction sites, whispering prayers, blessing tools, and mapping sacred geometry on scrolls few were allowed to see. The site's design mirrored Jerusalem, one complex symbolizing the earthly city, the other, the heavenly. Whether or not angels truly participated, the scale of the achievement remains baffling. Even modern engineers have scratched their heads at how such monumental structures could have been created with medieval tools. The trenches are so deep, the precision so high, and the layout so symbolically complex that the site continues to defy easy categorization. Yet for all his mystical association, Lalibela was also a shrewd politician. His religious constructions weren't just acts of piety, they were strategic. By making his capital a holy site, he centralized spiritual and political authority in one place. Pilgrims became subjects, religious awe became loyalty, stone became sovereignty. Today, the churches of Lalibela are still in use. Priests in white robes perform ancient liturgies, candles flicker in underground chambers, and the king who claimed angels as co-workers is remembered not just as a ruler, but as something stranger, a man who blurred the line between divine mandate and architectural miracle. And while Lalibela turned bedrock into sanctuaries, the next king turned his court into something far more animated, where elephants became legal consultants, and royal judgments were passed down from beneath flapping ears. King Tenkamenen, Ghana Empire, held open court with elephants as his audience. In the 11th century, the Ghana Empire, located in present-day Mali and Mauritania, was one of the most sophisticated and powerful realms in West Africa. And at its center stood King Tenkamenen, a monarch known as much for his wealth and governance as for his unusual court rituals, which included an audience of the most unexpected political observers, trained elephants. Yes, elephants. Not statues or symbols, but real, living, breathing animals that were present during Tenkamenen's public court sessions. While other monarchs employed scribes and soldiers, Tenkamenen presided over legal disputes and state affairs in the company of massive, tusked witnesses who stood as silent sentinels of royal justice. To the outsider, it might have looked like spectacle. To the people of the empire, it was governance wrapped in awe. Tenkamenen's court was remarkably progressive for its time. He held daily public audiences where subjects could voice grievances directly to him, a practice almost unheard of in the medieval world, where royalty was typically cloistered behind layers of bureaucracy and bloodline. These gatherings weren't reserved for nobles or dignitaries. Ordinary citizens could appear, present their case, and expect a ruling. But Tenkemenen understood that rulership wasn't just about justice, it was about theatre. The elephants weren't just ornamental. They were part of a performance meant to signal power, wisdom, and unshakable presence. In many African cultures, elephants were symbols of strength and authority. By surrounding himself with them, Tenkemenen made it clear that his judgments were not just legal, they were majestic. Some accounts claim the elephants were trained to react subtly to different moods in the court, flapping their ears when agitated voices rose, swaying gently when peace was restored. Whether or not that's true, their presence alone made a statement that the king was in control of not only his people, but of nature itself. Beyond the pageantry, Tenkemenen was a capable administrator. He maintained trade routes that linked the Ghana Empire to North Africa, facilitating the exchange of gold, salt, ivory, and ideas. He standardized weights and measures, enforced fair taxation, and promoted religious tolerance, allowing both Islamic and traditional spiritual practices to coexist. He ruled during a golden age, both figuratively and literally. The empire's access to gold mines made it one of the wealthiest in the world at the time. Tenkamenen's opulent court, complete with golden furnishings, intricate textiles, and elephant audiences, became the stuff of legend, earning mention in early Arabic historical texts that marveled at the empire's prosperity and organization. Tenkemenen died around 1078. Just as the empire began facing pressure from Almoravid invaders. But his legacy remained, a king who mixed majesty with accessibility, opulence with order, and who ensured that when justice was served, it was done so under the watchful gaze of giants. And while Tenkemenen shared his power with creatures of wisdom and weight, the next king multiplied his power through family, dozens of wives, hundreds of children, and a royal household that resembled not a court, but a small, well-dressed army of heirs. King Sobhuza II had over 70 wives and more than 200 children. If monarchs are remembered for scale, how much they conquered, how much they built, how much they changed, then King Sobhuza II of Swaziland should be remembered for something more personal. How much family he created. During his long reign, which stretched from 1921 to 1982, Sobhuza II fathered more than 200 children with over 70 wives, effectively turning his bloodline into a small demographic. Sobhuza II wasn't just a prolific patriarch, he was also the longest reigning monarch in recorded history, serving as king for over 60 years. His rule spanned British colonialism, Swaziland's independence in 1968, and the formation of a new constitutional monarchy. But behind the political transitions was a man deeply rooted in tradition and highly committed to expanding his own genetic legacy. The king's polygamy was not simply personal preference, it was cultural strategy. In Swazi tradition, royal polygamy helped secure alliances across clans and tribes. By marrying women from influential families, Sobhuza strengthened internal unity and minimized rebellion. Each wife represented a connection, each child a bond between the crown and the kingdom. It was matchmaking as statecraft. The result? A royal family so large it required its own administrative infrastructure. There were departments to manage the king's schedule with his wives, logistical teams for organizing ceremonies, and advisors just to track birthdays and relationships. One could argue that Sobhuza's domestic affairs were as complex as his foreign policy. But make no mistake, this was not mere indulgence. Sobhuza was a shrewd political operator. He played colonial and post-colonial politics with remarkable dexterity, maintaining a delicate balance between tradition and modernity. He dissolved Parliament in 1973, assuming absolute power, yet remained widely respected as a unifier and protector of Swazi identity. His rule, while authoritarian in structure, was seen by many as paternal rather than oppressive. And paternal he was, literally. His children have gone on to occupy influential positions throughout Swaziland, now Eswatini, including his son and successor, King Mswati III, who continued the tradition of polygamy and conservative monarchy. Some of Sobhuza's grandchildren now number in the hundreds. The royal family tree has become less of a diagram and more of a forest. Naturally, the king's personal life has attracted both awe and criticism. Outside observers often focused on the sheer volume of it all. The wives, the offspring, the sprawling palace grounds. But to Swazis, Sobhuza's family wasn't spectacle. It was a symbol of continuity, strength, and cultural pride in a world rapidly shifting toward modern abstraction. He died in 1982 at the age of 83, leaving behind a deeply rooted dynasty, a conservative constitution, and a kingdom that, despite external pressures, has clung tightly to tradition. And while Sobhuza used marriage to solidify his power, the next ruler used stone not as metaphor, but in sheer, monolithic self-portraiture, building temples so grand they dwarfed the gods they were supposedly meant to honor. Pharaoh Ramses II, Egypt, ordered statues of himself taller than the gods. If modesty were a virtue, Pharaoh Ramses II clearly missed the memo. Known as Ramses the Great, he wasn't content with ruling Egypt for over 6 decades, leading military campaigns and signing what may be history's first recorded peace treaty. No, he also wanted to be seen. Not just remembered, but immortalized in stone, on a scale so grand it made even the gods squint. Ramses II, who reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE, understood that architecture is propaganda carved in limestone. He commissioned colossal statues of himself across Egypt, towering figures with serene expressions and symmetrical features, lined up in neat, God-defying rows. The most famous examples are at Abu Simbel, where 4 6-foot-tall seated images of Ramses stare out over the Nile like stone titans, dwarfing the temple's actual religious occupants. To be clear, these temples were nominally dedicated to deities, but anyone approaching the gates of Abu Simbel knew whose ego truly filled the halls. Inside the sanctuaries, the pattern continues. Bas-reliefs show Ramses in endless triumphs, smiting enemies, making offerings, receiving divine praise. Sometimes he appears alongside gods, like Ra or Amun. Sometimes he appears as a god. The line between pharaoh and deity wasn't blurred, it was obliterated, one chisel at a time. But Ramses wasn't all show. He was a capable and effective ruler. His reign brought stability, wealth, and monumental building projects that put most of his predecessors to shame. He reasserted Egyptian control over parts of Canaan, constructed cities like Pi-Ramesses, and left behind more inscriptions, statues, and temples than perhaps any other ruler in the ancient world. He also had a gift for public relations. The famous Battle of Kadesh, a military stalemate with the Hittites, was transformed in temple inscriptions into a sweeping solo victory, complete with dramatic horse charges and miraculous escapes. Ramses knew the truth didn't need to win it, just needed to be carved in stone. Even in death, he remained enormous. His mummy, found centuries later, measured over 5.5 feet tall for an ancient Egyptian with red hair still visible. But the statues he left behind are what endure. They are impossible to ignore, impossible to forget, and perhaps that was the point. In the end, Ramses wasn't trying to be a humble servant of the gods. He was trying to become one by building a physical legacy so vast it outlasted myth. Today, when tourists gaze up at Abu Simbel, they aren't thinking of Amun or Ra. They are thinking of the man who made himself the central figure of divine architecture. And as Ramses turned his face into a mountain, the next king preferred a more intimate throne room, one where even his most personal functions became royal ceremony, and bowel movements were attended like diplomatic briefings. Louis XIV of France hosted royal bowel movements as court ceremony. By the late 17th century, France had become the theatre of Europe, and its undisputed leading man was Louis XIV, the Sun King, absolute monarch, and living embodiment of the phrase l'état, c'est moi. But beneath the powdered wigs, the courtly dances, and the endless mirrored hallways of Versailles lay a monarchy obsessed not just with appearances, but with ritual. All of it. Every waking, sleeping, eating, and yes, excreting moment. Among the most absurd of these rituals was the king's daily lever and coucher, his waking and sleeping ceremonies, attended by nobles who elbowed their way into proximity for the chance to hand him a sleeve or fluff his pillow. But the surrealism didn't stop there. Louis XIV also held what can only be described as royal bathroom audiences. In these moments, usually during his petit lever, the little rising, the king would sit upon a glorified commode known as the chaise percée, which looked like a high-backed throne with a strategically placed hole. While he did his business, courtiers attended him, ministers reported matters of state, nobles made small talk. Some simply stood and waited for a nod of recognition or the chance to hand the king his gloves afterward. It wasn't considered scandalous. It was considered an honor. This bizarre scene wasn't unique to Louis XIV. Earlier French kings had similar practices, but under his reign, it reached its most theatrical form. Versailles itself was designed to facilitate such access. The closer one's room was to the king's chambers, the higher their status. Even bowel-related proximity became a measure of political influence. So why the performance? Why reduce even the most private bodily function to court spectacle? The answer lies in control. Louis XIV understood the psychology of power. By turning his life into an unending ritual, he made himself indispensable and omnipresent. Nobles, desperate for favor, were drawn into a system where even the king's digestion could become a networking opportunity. The palace became less of a home and more of a stage, with a script written entirely by Louis. And it worked. The French nobility, once fractious and dangerous, were pacified by proximity and privilege. While they scrambled for access to the king's breakfast table or toilet, Louis consolidated power. He built the strongest centralized monarchy Europe had seen in centuries, all while being powdered, perfumed, and politely congratulated on his bowel movements. It's tempting to laugh, and history often does. But Versailles wasn't a joke. It was the most efficient court-based surveillance system ever invented, and Louis sat at its literal and figurative center. And while the Sun King ruled with flair and fragrance, the next queen lived under suspicion and confinement, smuggling her comfort not in politics or ceremony, but under her skirts, one paw at a time. Mary, Queen of Scots, smuggled tiny dogs under her skirts. During imprisonment, Mary, Queen of Scots, had a life that played out like a royal soap opera on high-stakes mode. Crowned queen at just 6 days old, married to the Dauphin of France by 16, widowed by 18, and then thrust back into the snakes and daggers world of Scottish politics, Mary didn't just rule, she survived. Or at least, she tried. Her real reign ended not in power, but in prison. And while her titles were stripped and her choices questioned, she clung to one luxury that couldn't be taken from her: her dogs. Specifically, her tiny lap dogs, delicate, silken-haired creatures, each no larger than a loaf of bread, and each treated with more affection than most of her advisors. During her 19 years of imprisonment in England, under the watchful and anxious eye of her cousin Elizabeth I, Mary's once opulent life was reduced to a few chambers, some embroidery, and a rather unorthodox form of emotional smuggling. She would keep her dogs under her skirts, literally. Hidden within the folds of heavy gowns and petticoats, they were her quiet companions, sometimes one or two at a time, sleeping against her legs, kept warm and concealed, like living secrets. These dogs weren't just pets, they were emotional armor. In a world where every word she uttered was intercepted, where letters were read and alliances broken overnight, these creatures were the only confidants she had left. They didn't judge her for 3 marriages, for the murder accusations, for the failed escapes, or the political miscalculations. They didn't care that she was a pawn in a decades-long battle of crowns. They simply sat, yawned, and offered the small but essential comfort of presence, a heartbeat next to her own. When Mary was eventually executed in 1587, the legend goes that one of her tiny dogs was hidden beneath her skirts on that very day. After her beheading, the dog reportedly refused to leave her side, staining its white fur with blood, and had to be forcibly removed from the scene. Whether the detail is entirely true or partially embroidered by sympathetic biographers, the image is haunting. A queen whose kingdom had crumbled, whose advisors betrayed her, still clinging to the soft warmth of loyalty in its purest form. In that way, Mary's story is more than just another tragic royal tale. It's a reminder of how intimacy endures when power vanishes, and how, sometimes, the only thing a fallen queen has left is what she can carry beneath the fabric of a gown. And while Mary soothed herself with silence and fur, the next king soothed himself in far stranger ways by lifting watches, swiping swords, and hoarding other people's treasures, not for strategy or necessity, but simply because he could. King Farouk of Egypt, the kleptomaniac king who stole Churchill's watch. King Farouk of Egypt may be one of the most misunderstood, or perhaps perfectly understood, monarchs of the 20th century. If Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her life being undone by political misfortune, Farouk undid himself with sandwiches, gambling, and a kleptomaniac streak that turned international diplomacy into something closer to a magic act gone wrong. Farouk came to power in 1936 at just 16 years old, inheriting a throne at a time when Egypt was juggling colonial entanglements, nationalist movements, and British influence. He was charming, young, and at first widely adored. But that didn't last. Power, it seemed, quickly became a toy in his hands, and Farouk, he liked toys, especially if they weren't his. Despite living in staggering opulence, multiple palaces, fleets of luxury cars, and reportedly eating enough food to feed a battalion at breakfast, Farouk developed an odd habit. He stole things. Not for political leverage, not for economic need, but because he apparently couldn't help himself. He would walk into rooms full of world leaders and leave with something that didn't belong to him, sometimes as petty as a lighter, sometimes as legendary as Winston Churchill's pocket watch. That particular theft became the stuff of diplomatic legend. While meeting with Churchill, Farouk allegedly admired the watch, waited for the right moment, and simply made it disappear. No explanation, no apology. It was never officially recovered. And that wasn't even the strangest object in his private stash. Farouk had an extensive collection of rare coins, some of which were stolen or mysteriously acquired from global museums. He once tried to steal a ceremonial sword from a visiting dignitary. He even kept a collection of pornographic playing cards from the 18th century, stored in ornate royal drawers. When palace staff cleaned his rooms after his exile, they found hoards of liberated items, everything from personal trinkets to state-owned treasures. His compulsion wasn't limited to small items. Farouk once ordered the Egyptian Navy to fire its cannons at sharks because he was afraid they were eating his fish. He purchased exotic animals on a whim, held absurdly elaborate feasts, and commissioned luxury yachts while half the country was teetering on economic instability. His people, once charmed, grew tired. The British, once indulgent, grew weary. And by 1952, the military led by General Mohammad Naguib and a certain ambitious young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser decided enough was enough. Farouk was forced to abdicate and was exiled to Italy, where he lived out his final years in relative obscurity, eating lavishly and reminiscing about lost watches. He died in a restaurant in Rome in 1965, reportedly after collapsing during a particularly heavy meal, the final indulgence in a life defined by too many. Farouk's reign was short, chaotic, and strangely comedic. He didn't lose his crown to betrayal or invasion, but to appetite for food, for luxury, for things that weren't his. And where he stole watches, the next king would find time itself slipping through his fingers, cursed, sickly, and shadowed by centuries of superstition. King Charles II of Spain, the Hex monarch, who was born cursed. When you think of a royal lineage collapsing under its own weight, there's no more sobering example than King Charles II of Spain, a monarch so physically frail and mentally impaired that even his own court believed he was the product of a curse, not a metaphorical one, a literal, demonic, witch-cast, Bible-documented hex. Born in 1661, Charles II was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. And it shows. By the time he took the throne in 1665 at just 4 years old, the once mighty Spanish Empire was spiraling, and Charles, tragically, seemed to embody the collapse in human form. His tongue was too large for his mouth, he could barely chew, his jaw jutted unnaturally due to generations of inbreeding, and his mental faculties were delayed from childhood through adulthood. Diplomats and foreign royals began referring to him as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. It wasn't just court gossip. Medical treatment in the 17th century was already a grim business, but Charles's condition inspired something darker. Priests performed exorcisms. Doctors recommended bloodletting and burning herbs. His advisors commissioned investigations into whether the king had been hexed by his enemies. At one point, they interrogated nuns for allegedly praying to the devil on his behalf. When science and religion failed to offer solutions, Spain turned to superstition. The problem, of course, wasn't witchcraft, it was genetics. The Habsburg dynasty had intermarried for generations, believing that keeping bloodlines pure meant consolidating power. The result was a gene pool so shallow it was more of a puddle. Charles was the final ripple. He had fewer distinct ancestors than most commoners, and it showed in everything from his physical health to his inability to govern effectively. Still, the throne was his, and he did try to rule, but Charles was constantly manipulated by ministers, clerics, and foreign ambassadors, all of whom treated the Spanish crown like a chess piece. His 2 marriages produced no heirs, which only intensified the court's obsession with black magic and divine punishment. The king was not just a ruler, he became a symbol of national anxiety. Spain looked at Charles and saw its future, and it was terrified. When he died in 1700 at the age of 38, childless and exhausted, Europe exhaled and then braced for war. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, as rival dynasties scrambled to claim the throne. The Habsburg era in Spain was over, but Charles's ghost lingered not as a tyrant or a hero, but as a warning. A monarchy can only defy nature for so long before nature starts taking notes. And if Charles's kingdom was shaped by paranoia and decay, the next Tsar's reign was polished daily, even in blizzards, because when your ruler demands gleaming buttons in a snowstorm, you don't question the weather. You question your priorities. Tsar Paul I of Russia ordered soldiers to polish uniform buttons daily, even in snowstorms. Of all the Russian emperors to walk the icy halls of power, Tsar Paul I might be the one who most resembled a walking contradiction, a man obsessed with military order who inspired chaos, a ruler devoted to discipline who trusted no one, and a monarch whose fear of disorder led him to implement one of the most infamously irrational military policies in imperial history, daily button inspections, regardless of the weather. Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great, came to the throne in 1796 after a lifetime spent in his mother's considerable shadow. Catherine had deliberately sidelined him, keeping him from political life while grooming his son, Alexander, as a potential heir. When Paul finally ascended to power, he ruled like a man who had been waiting too long and who had a lot to prove. Among his first priorities was reforming the Russian military, or rather, reshaping it in his own image. He admired Prussian militarism, the crisp uniforms, the rigid drills, the shine of order, and he wasted no time imposing it on his troops. One of the more infamous rules: every soldier's uniform buttons had to be spotless, not just occasionally, not just before parades, every single day. It didn't matter if there was a snowstorm, a flood, or a war on the horizon. Russian soldiers were required to present gleaming buttons at all times. The punishment for failure? Harsh. Officers could be demoted or publicly reprimanded. Ordinary soldiers faced physical discipline. The rule was so strict and so unbending that even seasoned generals rolled their eyes privately. Of course. Why the obsession with buttons? In Paul's mind, it wasn't about the buttons, it was about control. He believed that a soldier who kept his buttons polished was a soldier who could be trusted to follow orders. It was a small, visible measure of discipline, a symbol of obedience he could check at a glance. But this fixation was only the tip of the iceberg. Paul issued hundreds of edicts, many of them contradictory or enforced erratically. He reversed many of his mother's policies, banned French literature to prevent revolutionary ideas from spreading, and required nobles to wear outdated military uniforms. He also had a peculiar habit of conducting surprise inspections at all hours, often riding through garrisons unannounced, peering at soldiers' uniforms like a man inspecting mannequins. His paranoia extended far beyond military matters. He believed that nearly everyone, foreign ambassadors, his own advisors, even his own family, was plotting against him. To be fair, they were. His increasingly erratic behavior alienated the nobility, frustrated the army, and confused foreign powers. His reign lasted just 5 years. In 1801, a group of officers staged a palace coup. They confronted Paul in his chambers, hoping to force his abdication. The confrontation escalated. Paul did not survive it. And so ended the reign of the Tsar, who tried to polish an empire into perfection, only to find that shiny buttons can't stop a dagger in the dark. His successor, Alexander I, took the throne, but the memory of Paul's obsession lingered in Russia's military culture for decades. And while Paul tried to clean his empire one button at a time, the next emperor preferred a more theatrical approach, bestowing holy titles on horses, building temples for beasts, and rewriting reality in favor of a four-legged priest. Emperor Caligula made his horse a priest and nearly a consul. Of all the emperors Rome endured, and it really did endure, many few stirred up as much theatrical confusion as Caligula. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, he earned the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, as a child mascot during his father's military campaigns. The name stuck. So did the flair for drama. He began his reign in 37 CE with remarkable popularity. He was young, charismatic, and hailed as a new dawn after the paranoia of Tiberius. But within months, that fresh imperial glow began to flicker into something far more bizarre. Whether it was a medical breakdown, a power-fueled descent into madness, or just an extremely dark sense of humor, Caligula soon became less of an emperor and more of a performance artist trapped inside a dictatorship. His strangest act, elevating his horse to near consular rank. The animal in question was Incitatus, a favored steed whom Caligula reportedly treated with more courtesy than most senators. According to sources like Suetonius, the horse had a marble stable, an ivory manger, a purple blanket, a color reserved for royalty, and a necklace of precious stones. He also received daily oats mixed with gold flakes, as if his digestive tract deserved imperial taxation. But Caligula didn't stop at pampering. He wanted Incitatus to hold office. The emperor, seemingly bored with the Senate's predictability, joked or threatened to make his horse a consul, one of Rome's highest political positions. Some say it was satire, others call it lunacy. Either way, the message was clear. If a horse could do the job, maybe the Senate wasn't as essential as it liked to think. This wasn't just a prank. It was a calculated insult wrapped in absurdity. Caligula wielded power like a playwright, each decree and ceremony a twisted monologue. By proposing Incitatus as a political figure, he didn't just mock Rome's institutions, he made the Senate complicit in their own humiliation. To oppose him was treason. To comply was self-parody. And what made it worse, no one knew when he was serious. Was Incitatus truly on the list of consular candidates, or was it a running joke extended for months to keep everyone off balance? In Caligula's court, reality was fluid. He once declared himself a living god, ordered the construction of a floating bridge so he could ride across the sea on horseback, and demanded divine honors while still very much alive. His assassination in 41 CE came as a relief to the Senate. He was stabbed by members of the Praetorian Guard in a plot so desperate that even his wife and daughter were not spared. But the image of the horse priest lingered, a symbol of how power, unchecked, eventually turns surreal. And while Caligula appointed a horse to religious office, the next king would transform himself into something just as heavy. A walking, ironclad embodiment of royal insecurity, complete with armor fit for battle, or perhaps for a parade of compensations. King Henry VIII of England wore armor with a codpiece cannon. Few monarchs have dominated the historical imagination quite like Henry VIII. The 6 marriages, the split from the Catholic Church, the ever-shifting gallery of advisors and enemies. But beneath the heavy politics and heavier banquet tables lies one of his lesser-known obsessions: armor. Not just any armor, ridiculously extravagant armor. Henry didn't merely wear protection into battle. He turned it into a walking billboard for royal masculinity. His suits of armor were towering, intricate, and absurdly detailed, each piece designed not just to shield, but to project. And perhaps nothing projected more than the infamous codpiece cannon, a metal accoutrement so exaggerated that historians still debate whether it was satire, insecurity, or both. Henry's armour collection, some of which survives to this day in the Tower of London, includes pieces that weigh upwards of 90 pounds. They are masterpieces of Renaissance metalwork, etched with religious motifs, royal symbols, and inscriptions designed to intimidate enemies and impress courtiers. One suit even features a rotating helmet visor that mimics different facial expressions because why just glare when you can mechanically scowl? But the codpiece armour takes the crown. One version of the story goes that it included a detachable component that was not only grotesquely large, but also mechanically functional. More decorative than tactical, obviously, but designed to draw the eye and keep it there. Historians have argued over whether it truly functioned like a cannon. Probably not, but the nickname stuck for good reason. In truth, the codpiece was a standard fashion feature of the time, but Henry's version was like everything else he touched: bigger, louder, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't about protection. It was about projection. It screamed virility at a time when his ability to produce a male heir was under public scrutiny. And, in a delicious twist of historical irony, the very thing it was meant to symbolize fertility was one of Henry's great political vulnerabilities. Beyond the armor, Henry's obsession with image extended to portraits. He hired Hans Holbein the Younger to paint him larger than life, with broad shoulders, a massive stance, and a gaze like a Tudor thundercloud. Whether in oil or iron, Henry wanted to be seen as invincible. But reality was less flattering. He suffered from chronic leg ulcers in later life, became obese, and was often in pain. His once athletic frame was hidden beneath layers of velvet, fur, and, of course, steel. He couldn't lead armies anymore, but he could still look like he did. And so, Henry VIII remains one of history's best examples of how armour doesn't just conceal weakness, it advertises it. Loudly, with bells, whistles, and ornamental flourishes. And while Henry tried to armour his reputation with steel and bravado, the next sultan would go further, arming his paranoia with absolute power and turning a whisper of infidelity into a wave of state-sanctioned retribution. Sultan Ibrahim III, the Mad of the Ottoman Empire, drowned 280 concubines on suspicion of infidelity. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, then Sultan Ibrahim I is the cautionary tale, carved in gold and soaked in fear. By the time he took the Ottoman throne in 1640, Ibrahim had spent most of his life in confinement, literally. Born into the royal palace but never meant to rule, he was locked in the infamous cafes, the cage, a luxurious but deeply claustrophobic set of rooms designed to isolate and contain potential heirs. He emerged from this prison not as a seasoned leader, but as a man deeply paranoid, emotionally volatile, and utterly unprepared for the empire he was now supposed to rule. Ibrahim's reign would become one of the strangest and most unsettling in Ottoman history, characterized by bouts of erratic behavior, lavish indulgence, and destructive paranoia. The most infamous event of all? A mass execution of hundreds of his own concubines, 280, to be precise, based solely on a rumor that a single woman in his harem had been unfaithful. The story goes like this. A court official, possibly seeking favor or simply planting chaos, whispered to the Sultan that one of the concubines had been unfaithful, an accusation with no proof, no names, just a breeze of suspicion. But for Ibrahim, who had already been oscillating between extremes of desire and dread, that whisper was enough to trigger disaster. Rather than investigate, he ordered the entire harem involved in the rumor to be executed 280 women, some of whom had never even met the Sultan. Their only crime was proximity to a whisper. This was not justice. This was fear masquerading as control. But what makes this episode even more surreal is that it came from a ruler whose public persona often tilted toward the ridiculous. Ibrahim was obsessed with luxury and extravagance, ordering robes made from ermine, commissioning walls lined with sable, and declaring spontaneous edicts about diet and fashion. At one point, he demanded that all of Constantinople's furriers surrender their inventories so he could roll in the furs for comfort. He was also fixated on physical objects. Some sources say he became enamored with a particular large fish he saw at market, naming it after one of his concubines and treating it as a talisman of fertility. Others claim he had a favorite tulip bulb that he kept in a jewel-studded case. These might sound whimsical until you remember he ruled an empire of tens of millions. Eventually, the empire couldn't take it anymore. His erratic behavior, disregard for advisors, and outbursts of violence led to a palace coup. His own mother, the powerful Kosam Sultan, reportedly supported his deposition. In 1648, after just 8 years on the throne, Ibrahim was overthrown and later executed. Today, Ibrahim I is remembered less as a ruler and more as a storm, unpredictable, destructive, and fueled by a kind of royal madness that made the walls of Topkapi Palace tremble. And if he drowned his empire in suspicion, the next monarch would build his reign on a towering paradox, an army not of warriors, but of carefully curated giants. King Frederick William I of Prussia built an army of giant soldiers. In an age where monarchs measured power through territory, treasure, or treaties, King Frederick William I of Prussia chose an unusual yardstick: height. Not his own, he was average in stature, but that of his soldiers. The king became singularly obsessed with building the most intimidating army possible, not through superior weaponry or strategy, but through sheer verticality. Known as the Soldier King, Frederick William I ruled Prussia from 1713 to 1740, and was a militarist through and through. But he was also eccentric. His idea of military excellence was distilled into a personal project that bordered on obsession: the creation of the Potsdam Giants, a regiment composed entirely of exceptionally tall men, preferably over 6'7", in a century when the average European male barely cracked 5'6". To Frederick William, these towering soldiers were not just military assets, they were living art. He delighted in dressing them in ornate uniforms and parading them before foreign dignitaries like prized stallions. He painted their portraits, commissioned murals of them, and watched their drills with giddy satisfaction. When he was depressed or anxious, he'd have them march through his garden to cheer him up. Some people collect stamps. He collected giants. Recruiting these men became a royal obsession. Prussian agents scoured Europe looking for tall candidates, offering money, promotions, or favors in exchange for enlistment. If persuasion didn't work, coercion sometimes did. There are stories, some possibly exaggerated, of men being kidnapped simply because they had long legs and the unfortunate luck of passing through Prussia. The Potsdam Giants, formerly the Grand Grenadiers of Potsdam, weren't even known for their combat performance. In fact, Most of them were too large to be nimble on the battlefield. Their real function was ceremonial, to impress, to intimidate, and to fulfill the strange vision of a king who believed height equaled might. Ironically, Frederick William himself was a harsh and austere man, frugal in government spending, obsessed with discipline, and known to strike nobles with his cane for minor offences. He wore plain clothes, avoided luxury, and considered most forms of art to be frivolous. Except, of course, when it came to his beloved giants. For them, he spared no expense. His fixation didn't end with his own life. When Frederick William was on his deathbed, it's said that he wanted to be surrounded by his tallest soldiers, as if their looming shadows might guide him into the afterlife. His son, Frederick the Great, would later disband the giant regiment, not out of disrespect, but because he understood what his father had not. Size doesn't win wars, strategy does. Still, the image remains. A king whose dream army was built not of warriors, but of walking monuments. And while Frederick William sought strength in inches, the next emperor would look for salvation in scripture, consuming holy pages, not for wisdom, but for healing. Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopia. 8 pages from the Bible, believing they would cure him. By the early 20th century, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia had accomplished what few African rulers ever did during the age of European colonization. He beat the Europeans at their own game. In 1896, Menelik led Ethiopian forces to a stunning victory over Italy at the Battle of Adwa, a triumph that preserved Ethiopia's sovereignty and made him an international symbol of African independence. He modernized Ethiopia's infrastructure, introduced telegraphs and railroads, and built diplomatic ties with Western powers. But in his final years, the same man who outwitted colonial generals and brokered alliances with European royalty developed a rather unique method of treating illness. He ate the Bible, literally, page by page. Menelik had suffered a stroke in 1909 and spent the last years of his life largely incapacitated. His health declined, and as doctors struggled to treat him with what limited medical knowledge was available in Ethiopia at the time, the emperor turned to something more divine. Convinced that the Holy Bible contained healing powers not just spiritually, but physically, he began tearing out pages and ingesting them, hoping, it seems, that consuming the Word of God might heal his failing body. The Bible, after all, had played a central role in Ethiopian religious life for centuries. Ethiopia was one of the first nations to adopt Christianity as a state religion, and Menelik considered himself a deeply devout Christian monarch, one ordained not only to rule, but to protect the faith. His empire was filled with ancient churches carved into cliffs, illuminated manuscripts copied by hand, and priests who carried sacred scrolls through the highlands like relics of fire. So perhaps, in his mind, devouring the scripture wasn't desperation, it was devotion. Of course, modern medicine would offer a different view. Ink and parchment, no matter how divinely inspired, are not designed for human digestion. The act, while symbolic, likely hastened the emperor's decline. But even this final act of spiritual fervor feels strangely consistent with Menelik's rule, a man who believed so fully in Ethiopia's destiny that he mixed technology with mysticism, progress with tradition. It's easy to romanticize it. The warrior king who built railways and ate Bibles. But the truth, as always, is more complex. In those last years, Ethiopia was increasingly pressured by foreign interests. His court was divided, his health was fragile, and in the pages of that Bible, perhaps Menelik wasn't just looking for a cure, he was looking for control, for order, for a way to impose divine logic on a body and a kingdom. slipping beyond his grasp. And while Menelik ingested sacred pages for salvation, the next king would devote his entire reign to chasing sorcery, waging war not against foreign armies, but against the shadowy idea that witches were hiding in plain sight. King James VI of Scotland. James I of England. Obsessed with witch hunting. Before he became King of England, James VI of Scotland had already crowned himself something far more dramatic: God's most determined witch hunter. Long before Salem ever got its firewood ready, James had already lit the match. His obsession with witchcraft began in the late 16th century, during what should have been a perfectly ordinary honeymoon. In 1590, after marrying Anne of Denmark, James set sail home with his bride, only to be caught in a ferocious storm at sea. Ships were damaged, men were lost, and James barely made it back to Scottish shores. The cause, he declared, was not meteorological, but malevolent. Witches. He was convinced that a coven of witches in North Berwick had summoned the storm to assassinate him, and once James was convinced, he didn't dabble, he doubled down. He personally supervised interrogations and trials, overseeing confessions that, let's say, were not freely given. The North Berwick witch trials became a national event, and dozens of accused witches, many of them women who simply owned cats, read herbs, or didn't conform to social expectations, were tried and executed. But James wasn't just a participant. He became an author. In 1597, he published Demonology, a full treatise on demons, witches, and how to identify them. It read like a political manifesto, dressed up in theology, blending biblical references, folklore, and legal procedures into one very stern piece of moral performance. The book not only legitimized the persecution of witches, it gave it scholarly flair. So when James became King of England in 1603, succeeding the childless Elizabeth I, he brought his witch-hunting enthusiasm south. And while English law was slightly more restrained than Scottish justice, James's paranoia still found purchase. He encouraged witch trials, promoted judges who supported his views, and continued to write and speak about the dangers of hidden sorcery, undermining the moral fibre of the nation. What's fascinating is how selective his skepticism was. James was famously intellectual fluent in multiple languages, fascinated by philosophy, patron of Shakespeare. Yet when it came to the supernatural, he willingly abandoned logic in favour of dramatic certainty. To him, witches were not metaphors or misunderstood herbalists. They were real enemies of the state. And he believed that rooting them out was not just justice, it was divine duty. In truth, James's witch hunting was as much about politics as belief. In a time of religious upheaval, royal insecurity, and constant whispers of treason, witchcraft became a catch-all label for disobedience. To be accused was to be silenced. To be punished was to prove the king's righteousness. And yet, in a twist of royal irony, James, so obsessed with moral surveillance, was succeeded by generations of monarchs who would privately indulge in the very behaviours he tried to exorcise from society. Because while James hunted the hidden, the next king brought secrecy right into the palace by commissioning films no one was meant to see. King Alfonso XIII of Spain commissioned secret films for private palace screenings. If most monarchs indulged in statecraft during daylight and scandal by moonlight, King Alfonso XIII of Spain preferred his shadows on celluloid. Born in 1886 and declared king the day he was born because his father had died while Alfonso was still in the womb, his life was one of preordained glory, national expectation, and personal detours. Especially the kind best kept behind locked palace doors. Alfonso XIII ruled Spain from 1886 until 1931. overseeing a tumultuous era marked by political instability, colonial collapse, and rising republicanism. But while the country around him edged toward revolution, Alfonso developed an interest that wasn't exactly standard royal fare: silent films. And not just any silent films, he reportedly commissioned a series of risque motion pictures for his private viewing, screened discreetly in the royal palace. The details are foggy, as most secrets worth knowing usually are, but the rumors persist, and they're supported by evidence. In the 1,970 seconds, film historians unearthed a cache of silent-era reels in Spain, now referred to as the King's Collection, produced under a pseudonymous company that conveniently had ties to royal funding. The content? Let's just say it wasn't being prepared for wide theatrical release. These weren't highbrow dramas or sweeping historical epics. They were, in a word, intimate. What's most compelling is not the existence of the films themselves, but what they reveal about Alfonso's internal contradiction. Publicly, he was a monarch trying to project tradition. Privately, he was a man chasing modernity in its most provocative form. He was fascinated by the camera, its power to preserve, to provoke, to peer in without being seen. While his court clung to royal etiquette, Alfonso slipped into the future, flickering and silent. But this fascination with the underground mirrored his political style. Alfonso never quite fit into the modern constitutional mold expected of monarchs. He dabbled in authoritarianism, supported coups when it suited him, and failed to steer Spain through a series of national crises, most notably the disastrous war in Morocco and the deepening class divide at home. He wanted control, but not accountability, influence, but not consequence. Eventually, the contradictions caught up with him. In 1931, with the Second Spanish Republic gaining momentum, Alfonso fled into exile. He was never formally deposed, but the writing was on every wall in Madrid. He died in Rome in 1941, his legacy split between political failure and whispered tales of royal celluloid curiosities. If nothing else, Alfonso XIII serves as a perfect example of how the private tastes of kings often reveal more than their public decrees. And while he dabbled in shadows and screens, the next emperor dispensed with subtlety altogether, crowning himself with golden eagles and bankrupting a nation in a single, surreal day of glory. Emperor Bokassa, Central African Republic, crowned himself in leopard robes on a golden throne. If Alfonso XIII was a king of whispers and velvet curtains, Jean Bedel Bokassa was a man of smash cuts and thunderous applause, mostly self-generated. A former military officer turned absolute ruler, Bokassa declared himself Emperor Bokassa I of the Central African Empire in 1976. Not king, not president, emperor, because apparently one crown was too small for the grandeur he had in mind. His coronation, an event that can only be described as Napoleonic cosplay on a shoestring budget, took place on the 4th of December 1977 in a ceremony so lavish it reportedly consumed nearly a third of the national budget. The scene looked like a hallucination funded by delusion and desperation. Bokassa arrived in a diamond-studded carriage drawn by white horses, wearing a robe lined with leopard fur and topped with a velvet cape that rivaled any opera costume in Europe. But the crown jewel literally was the golden throne. Shaped like a majestic eagle with outstretched wings, it sat beneath a red canopy designed to mimic the imperial glory of Napoleon Bonaparte, whom Bokassa openly idolized. And when the time came to be crowned, Bokassa did not wait for anyone to place it on his head. Like Napoleon, he seized the crown and placed it on himself, because if you have to ask for legitimacy, you don't really have it. The audience included foreign dignitaries, diplomats, and a confused cast of invited guests who politely clapped while trying to calculate whether their airfare had been worth it. France, notably, helped fund much of the coronation. Why? Because Bokassa, for all his eccentricities, was useful to European powers as long as he kept communists out and French interests in. But for the people of the Central African Republic, the spectacle was harder to justify. The country was impoverished, its infrastructure crumbling, and its citizens struggling with food scarcity. Bokassa's imperial fantasy was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Unsurprisingly, the reign of Emperor Bokassa I was short and chaotic. Behind the extravagant titles and theatrical displays, his government was increasingly authoritarian. Dissent was crushed, opposition silenced, and paranoia reigned as fiercely as the emperor himself. By 1979, Bokassa's luck ran out. While he was abroad, ironically visiting Libya, French troops launched a coup to remove him from power. He returned from his trip not to adoring crowds, but to exile in Côte d'Ivoire. Eventually, he was put on trial in the very country he tried to rebrand as an empire, convicted of various abuses, and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted. He died in 1996, still claiming to be emperor at heart. A man who once dreamed of grandeur now rests as a cautionary tale. When ego outpaces reality, thrones become theatre, and nations become footnotes. And with that, we close the list, not with quiet legacy, but with a roar of gold-plated absurdity. 53 royal stories, each more bizarre than the last. But perhaps the real mystery isn't their madness, it's why we keep building crowns for people who want to wear them this badly.